Welcome back, everyone. I just told someone that this was one of the best poster sessions I've ever attended, so I hope everyone had as much fun as we did, and the lunch was nice. I like the cookies. Next, we have Valeria Gonzalez from Reed College for a great talk. Please welcome her.
Hi, can you hear me just fine? Well, thank you for being here. For good or bad reasons, I'm going to be talking a lot about animals. So if you don't like animals, don't be offended if you walk away. Also, just want to say that I finished my first year as an assistant professor. So yay to me that I survived. Especially with everything that's going on. Okay, so I just want to walk you a little bit through the journey that I have done, moving a little bit from different animal models to get to where I am today. But I'm going to start a little bit with the annoying parts of defining certain concepts that I think is important that we're in the same page. On one end, I want to introduce the concept of decision making, and I'm just going to define it as is usually defined in psychology, as the cognitive process resulting in the selection of a belief of a course of action among several possible alternative of options. And I just want to highlight that we need to make decisions every day. And decisions are rarely simple if we really start to break down what making a decision really is. Even if we're making a kind of casual decision about picking a cereal from a supermarket, you're somehow combining several options or several aspects of the different options into a single value, which is what usually we call subjective value. So even if you're just picking a cereal, you're comparing flavor, size, price, maybe you're looking at the calorie intake, ingredients, et cetera, et cetera. So somehow our brains combine all those things together to make you decide that one cereal is a better option than another. But because decisions are rarely simple, even with situations like this in which you have too many options, it's very common that decisions can make us anxious. But on the other end of the spectrum, and one of the things that really bring us together today is information seeking. Contrary to what some other people have presented, in the animal world, usually nature is full of uncertainty, so actually, contrary to what happened to humans, we don't know what's going on in nature. And animals are confronted with a lot of sources of uncertainty that they need to manage to navigate. So it makes sense in that sense that animals are going to try to reduce the uncertainty that they have. And again, other people have showed those examples too when you're just waiting for results of applications. So if we're trying to reduce uncertainty because uncertainty doesn't seem something that is pleasant, then it makes sense that we can consider information as reinforcing. And there is other people better than me that can explain and talk about that. So I just want to highlight that that seeking information is pretty widespread between different species. Okay? And lastly, I just want to mention, but not get too stuck in it, between the whole definition that we have talked already this morning between instrumental and non-instrumental information. Actually, during the poster session, I was talking with Jennifer about, do we really have examples of non-informative information, of non-instrumental information, sorry? Because in a way, we can always adjust long-term or decisions or the path that we're following to actually use that information in future situations. But anyway, one of the main reasons what brought me to this topic when I was in grad school was that this idea that people would claim that non-instrumental decisions can be considered suboptimal. Because technically, if that consequence is not really changing the outcome, then you shouldn't really care about choosing information. And again, we have several explanations about this, the amount of time that we spend just looking at results when elections are going in the US, which is something that is very intriguing to me, how long it takes to get results. So you're waiting for a couple of days, sometimes even longer, and yeah, I can see how that's very anxious-inducing. And the same when it happens when we're waiting for results of applications. But really the situation that I was starting to wonder is, at the end, how much are you willing to sacrifice just for the sake of knowing? So the task that I'm going to be talking about, and it's going to guide the whole talk, it's a task in which on one end we have a simultaneous choice between two alternatives that give a delayed reward. So there is a time in between, a waiting time in between. And the alternatives are going to differ in mainly two aspects. On one aspect, you have the amount of information / uncertainty that you have there. And the other aspect is how much food they're giving you, how much richness it is embedded in that option. So very early on when I started this, and again, a lot of this information seeking with this task, actually it's very old literature from the 50s, from like the behavioral aspect, animal people that were working on this. And actually my very first subjects to work on this were pigeons. So just to give you like a general roundout about how this task works for the animals, the pigeon is gonna be confronted, and that's what I have a picture there of. Actually, the very good-looking one on top is Darwin. It's a star pigeon that really learns very quickly everything that you teach the guy. But we have touch screens, and what you present there is 2 cues that they can pick. If they pick, for instance, the left side, 80% of the time that cue will transform into a red color key. That is 80% of the time. When they see that one, it's always going to be followed by no reward. The rest of the time, or actually the minimum of time, 20% of the time, when they pick that left one, they're going to see a green light that is always going to be rewarded. So we're going to talk that that's the informative option, because actually seeing each cue will indicate the animal how the trial is going to end. In the other hand, if the pigeon picks the right option, they're always going to be followed by another cue that 50% of the time is going to be followed by food, and the other half by no food. So seeing that yellow key is not really informing the animal how the trial is going to end. Yep, and the thing that I forget to mention is that all those cues are on for a few seconds before actually the animal gets access to the consequence. So they're waiting, not knowing in one case if what's going to happen or not. But the other aspect that is very important here is that one option, the informative one, is only gives food on 20% of the trial, so there is a cost to it. And the non-info gives food 50% of the time. Now, we can argue that both of them are pretty bad, but one is definitely worse than the other. Pigeons tend to have a very standard performance that is very extreme. So they pick information almost 100% of the time, and this has been replicated a million times. So we're very sure that this is the case, and we have played with a lot of different variables to understand what's happening there. So because I don't want to extend too much into this, so you're just going to have to believe me, the things that I worked with then led me to 3 main conclusions. On one end, animals are 100%, or pigeons are 100% sensitive that one option gives less food than the other. So any choice for information is not because they're missing that one option actually is worse, or they're losing food compared with the other. They're very aware, and they adjust. If you manipulate the amount of food that each option is given, the pigeon will navigate and move their preference depending on that. If you manipulate the amount of information in the sense of the probabilities associated with it, the animals also followed a pretty nice linear relationship between the amount of information and the preference that they exhibit. Now, mind that even in that case, they don't get, when you start to mess too much with probabilities, the values don't get that extreme. So. And then the last thing that other people have reported just this morning with human literature is that actually the type of information or the balance of the information matters. So pigeons, just like humans, if you give them bad information, they don't prefer it as much as when you give them information about good news. So the difference in the drawing that I was showing you between the green and the red light is actually different. They prefer the green one, and they tend to not prefer, I wouldn't say it's extreme that they reject it, but they tend to not prefer as much the bad news. Okay, so that's a little bit what I did with pigeons. And me and other bunch of people have played a lot with the different parameters that we can think of in this behavioral task. So I will claim, quotation mark, that the behavioral antecedents are kind of clear, and we know what's going on there. But something that is really interesting that happens here is that, as I show you there, pigeons have a very, very extreme preference for information. And when you manipulate the values, it's very, very hard for them to move away from it. But with the rats, when people start to try the exactly same task, but apply it to rats, then the results were a lot more variable. And just to give you a sense, the task is exactly the same. The only difference is that we adjust for rats. So instead of pecking, they're pressing a lever. And instead of a visual cues, we're switching to auditory cues. So the task is very much the same. And something that I really want to highlight, because sometimes it gets a little bit confusing, is that the sounds that the rats are hearing is one at a time. So some trials are followed by one cue, and other trials are followed by a different cue. So the probabilities that I show that were 20 and 80 is the number of times that they will listen to each sound in each trial. But the structure is the same. So if they pick the info option, sometimes they're gonna listen to one sound that is associated with food, always. The rest of the time, that same option is gonna lead to a different sound that is gonna be followed by no reward. And the other one is still 50-50. So I'm gonna show you the general performance that we get with rats. I want you to just look at the very first, let me see if I can get my pointer here. Okay, so the very first one, this is the preference for information. It's a little bit all over the place. So we don't get the results that happen with pigeons, that they get very extreme in their preference. Rats do a little bit of everything depending on the conditions that you put them in. These are individual subjects. So these are not sections. Those are a lot of rats. But something that is very similar to what you observe with pigeons and with starlings and other animals is that on one end, when you look latency to choose the option, you find the same pattern, which I think is very intriguing. I'm not going to talk too much about it today, but you're welcome to talk after the fact with me, which is latency to choose shows consistently across animals and across manipulations. They're faster when there is a true choice compared when there is a for choice. So obviously, when we train the animals to make sure that they're actually choosing because they understand the contingencies, we force the animals a bunch of times to just pick one option or the other. And then we also confront them with what we will call a true choice. And they're always faster in the true choice compared with force trials, which is a little bit against what a lot of the human literature have shown in this case. The other thing that is also very consistent across the literature is that the times that the animals goes to check the food port while they're waiting for the reward usually distributes according with the contingencies of the queues. So they will go and check many, many times in front of the queue that is always reward. They check very little with the queue that is associated with no reward. And they kind of check in between with the one that is 50% reinforced. Very, very expected. You expect that that's only telling us that the animals are actually tracking what's going on. Now, after that, and I'll blame Ethan that I don't know where he's sitting, but part of while we start to map these different brain regions, because as you will hear later on, Ethan has done a lot of this work with monkeys. So we were saying, well, rats should do the same. And we have evidence from other different tasks that are trying to assess these areas being involved in decision-making and information seeking. So we target those three. And now recently in my lab, we also add the dorsolateral striatum there. And I'm going to show you a little bit because we just kind of start collecting the data, so it's very preliminary. For the people that are not neuroscience members in this audience, I'm just going to briefly explain how I did this manipulation of these 4 brain regions that I'm showing you here. What we use is DREADS, which is designer receptors exclusively activated by designer drugs. It's a very long name, that's why we just go by DREADS. But we're basically doing with this, and the only thing that I want you to care about if you are not a neuroscientist, is that we're inserting a viral vector in the brain region that we're targeting, so that way we can either inhibit or excite that brain region when we give an animal that designer drug. So it is specifically the receptors that we're building in that brain region are only going to be activated by that drug that we're giving the animal, which in this case is CNO. In our case, what we were doing here was inhibit. So we were inhibiting the BLA, the ACC, and the OFC in different animals to see if actually their preference will change depending on having that area online or not. And what you're seeing in the corner here is just our expression that our viral vectors were actually doing, or were in the place that they were supposed to be. Okay, so the results here, I'm going to separate by sex, because we did find something interesting there. What I'm showing you here, contrary to the previous graph that I showed you before, is not the actual preference. So this is not the info preference as I've been showing you so far. But this is the preference change with respect to what they were doing before. So this is an index. It's just a subtraction. It's not very complicated, but a 0 means that they haven't changed their preference when that inhibition happened with respect to what they were doing in baseline. So before we inhibit that different brain regions, this is what they were doing before. So we're just, the further away they're from 0, that means that there is a bigger change in preference. And as you can see with the males, there is not a lot of change there. So we didn't really find an effect across the board when we inhibit any of these brain regions in males. But something interesting that happened is that we did have an effect specifically on the ACC, so frontal region, that it seems that they went, again, CNO, which is when we actually inhibit, the goal is just a control, we saw that the animals depart from whatever was their baseline. And what is important here is that the directionality is not like all the animals start to prefer information or all the animals start to prefer non-information. They depart in different ways. So it's almost like we create a lot of noise when we inhibit the ACC. What is interesting here to mention is that we didn't observe any changes in latency, and we didn't observe any changes also in response rate. So there is not an issue with animals being slower in their decision. It's not that they're not tracking what's going on, so they keep sampling the cues in the way that they're supposed to. So it's not like they don't understand the task. It's something about the value of the choice that got messed up when we inhibit the ACC on females. When we start to model this, trying to find the best predictor of preference here, what we find here, again, this is split by females and males. The best predictor, as not very surprising, of future choices is the previous choice. But when we split that depending on if the previous trial was rewarded or not, we find something really interesting. The animals had this tragedy, and I want you to focus on the middle graph here, or here for the males, is that if the previous trial was rewarded in the info option, again, that option that is only 20% of the time rewarded, they will switch. Which is, we can say that's the optimal strategy, because if you just got rewarded, it's very likely that the next trial is not gonna be rewarded. So the animals switch, but that's not true for the females. So there is something about tracking the previous reward that gets they lost in that translation when we inhibit the ACC. So again, this predictor also was consistent with what we found in the actual preference. I'll go back to ACC in a second, but I just want to show you very preliminary what we're being finding on the DMS, dorsomedial striatum. So again, this is just showing some control animals. This is acquisition, so this is just the normal preference that they're developing. And nothing special there, but I also want you to see that dichotomy that you see that some animals are preferring information. Actually, most of them in this case do not. But then when we did, again, inhibit with rats, the DMS, we didn't really find an effect. Again, allegedly, we haven't confirmed all the expression of all those animals, so this is still ongoing. But it doesn't seem that there was something going on. And we were very confused about this because DMS is pretty implicated in action and goal tracking, so we were a little bit confused about that, so we decided to do a follow-up, actually lesion the DMS to see if there was actually something going on or not. And we did this in two different ways, something that I actually haven't done before, that was start to, we lesioned the DMS right before the animals got put in the task, but also during performance, different sets of animals. And again, this is very preliminary. It seems that things are very chaotic with the learning. So there is something going on there that seems that there is a delay to stabilize their preference when we lesion the DMS before they learn the task. But it also seems to be something going on with performance that we didn't see with DREADS inhibition. And we can talk in the Q&A about what that means or what's going on. But again, we didn't really see a difference in response rate, and also we didn't see anything in latency. So the only very striking effect that we found was ACC inhibition. So next we were trying to target when in this task that is very long and very complicated was actually contributing to this effect that we observed. So here we move to another technique that can the same logic but just have high temporal resolution. So we're doing optogenetics, targeting the ACC. And what we're trying to do here really was we inhibit the ACC during the presentation of the cue that predicts reward or during the ITI, during that time in between trials. And we didn't see any effects in terms of preference. We didn't see any effects in terms of latency. This is just showing you that our baseline response rate was exactly the same as all the other experiments that I have shown you. The inhibition of the cue that predicts reward also didn't give any result, but there was something going on when we inhibit during the ITI. So reward seeking during the informative cue decreased following ACC inhibition, which to us indicates a causal contribution of this region in supporting reward expectation to cue signaling reward with certainty, which kind of indicates that there is a common role for ACC in maintaining persistence towards certain and valuable rewards. So it's not a motivation-based effect, but it seems to be more about paying attention to what you need to do next that is necessary and might explain the results that we have. Okay, so again, they give you a lot of information there, but something that I kind of mentioned, but I didn't dive into it, and in the last few minutes, I want to talk to you about this, is that I mentioned very early on that there is a striking difference between pigeons always prefer information, and it's really hard to break that preference, but with the rats, we have a little bit of everything going on, which a lot of people think that that's a bad thing, but I think it's a great thing because it allows us to explore what are the aspects that are really contributing to this preference. So this is the data that I didn't show you about that optogenetics experiment, but the initial acquisition. So it's just this is splitting the animals, and I'm categorizing that by the phenotype, so if they were preferring the non-info option or the info option. So again, it's very common that most of the animals end up in a split in between the two, and we have a few animals that get in between, kind of like an indifference point, but most of them we can categorize in between one and the other. So one of my students thought that maybe that preference had to do with certain baseline levels of anxiety. So see there in the picture there, the thesis last year, actually it's this year's technically, this last academic year, looking at the levels of anxiety and if that correlate with the amount of info preference. The idea was that the more anxious you were, the more you were seeking information. And what I'm showing you here is that the relationship is actually the opposite. The more they seek information, actually they explore more the EPM. So at the end, our whole argument about like this is anxiety-based might be that it's actually, and this is what like Cedar was trying to convince me to, is this is about curiosity. If you're more curious and you feel safe in the environment, you're more likely to explore more, which it was contrary to what I was expecting it to happen. But also something that was very striking in this when I moved to read compared to what I was doing before was the enrichment conditions of the animals. My rats before at UCLA didn't have any type of enrichment, and the animals at read have a lot of enrichment. And they get socialized, there is like a rat club, that there's a bunch of undergrads that just come to play with the rats. So it's a very different set of rats. So at UCLA I said I have my sad rats, and then we have really happy rats. Don't quote me on that, I shouldn't have said that. But what we did next is like, actually, let's quantify that. So what we put during this last summer with another student there that now is going to start thesising with me, with Erin, was to assign animals to 4 different enrichment conditions, in which basically we're manipulating just 2 factors, social and physical enrichment. So you have one animal with one of each, an animal that has a combination of 2, and an animal that has none at all, which will be the sad rats. And we put them through the task again. And something really interesting happened. Again, this is very preliminary data, so we don't have a lot of, you can see the data points there, there's not a lot of rats. In terms of like latency, everything seems very similar, but what is very interesting is that it seems that the stronger info preference is for the non-enriched animals, which is a little bit consistent with what I have found before. And the animals that have a lot of social enrichment are the ones that prefer information the least. Now the other 2 groups are a little bit of a mix. And interesting enough, it seems that we have a split between the group that has physical enrichment and social enrichment, almost like it's a combination between the 2. And when we evaluate those animals also in the EPM, we also find the same correlation in the same direction as the study before, in which the animals that spend more time or less time in the closed space or exploring more are actually also the ones that have a stronger info preference. So this is consistent with the graph that I just showed you before. So there is something, it's not just the information, it's also the environmental factors that were contributed in this test is affecting if our animals are more info preferring or not, which is something that I personally think has been neglected for a while, looking at the environmental conditions and how they contribute to different preference in animals. And with that, I'm going to start to summarize. So I show you that information seeking is widespread, but there is variability between species, or I hope that convinced you of that. I found that ACC involved in express a stable preference and to maintain focus on the goal, but we didn't find BLA, OFC, and DMS to be involved in maintaining preference, but maybe in learning, and we need to explore what's going on with DMS a little bit more too. Curiosity might be a driver on information seeking in animals too, and social and physical enrichment affect info preference, with social versus non-enrichment having the most extreme preference there. And with that, I want to thank a bunch of people, my lab, my two postdoc lab, also other labs that helped me, like the WASM lab, my postdoc that is sitting over there, and a bunch of students that collect this data in the last 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very cool. Could I ask? I'm especially interested in the enrichment aspect. So, if I understand right, it's sort of like the physical enrichment alone was almost like keeping the info preference high. The social was putting it lowest, and if you had both, it was kind of intermediate. So, I'm wondering how would you kind of interpret that? Could it be that, for example, there might be a balance between information seeking about physical things versus social things? So maybe when they're socially enriched, they're like, actually, I'm more interested in information about other animals, and so I'm actually less interested in information about physical rewards in front of me or something like that.
Yeah, it could definitely be something like that. I think the group that was more intrigued to me was exactly the combination of the two, because you see, again, this is preliminary data, but you see a split between animals being low here and animals being higher up. And something that, this is anecdotally, and we can put data in a paper, but the animals that have both, so they have a peer in the box and also social, a toy to play with, they will fight a lot more over the toy. So much that there were some toys that we realized that they were the favorite ones, like a piece of stick. They really like the piece of stick. So we have to put two because then we will start to see increases in aggression because they were fighting over resources. So I think it might be, and something that I do want to explore and I would like to add, is if we can actually evaluate which one of the animals is the alpha in that pair. So I think something about the split here might be a competition for resource, exactly. So it might be that the ones that are high up and the non-dominant ones and the ones that don't prefer information are the dominant ones. What that says about seeking information, I don't want to speculate too much about it, but there is something about like having access to safely to the resources that competition, I think it goes kind of like in that direction, and that's what I besides the EPM, I do want another test to be able to establish which of the animals is the dominant one and which one is not. And I do believe that's gonna like explain that split that we have there.
Okay, sorry. Great talk. I wonder, these individual differences in like info seekers and non-info seekers, have you thought about it, or does it relate to it all sign trackers versus goal trackers? It looks like you have.
Yes, it has. There is like one old paper that did that, but they established if the animals were sign and goal trackers in the traditional paradigm with a peak procedure and all that, and then they put them in the info task. But nobody has directly evaluated that, and actually that student is gonna do that for her thesis. She's gonna put the animals in the task and see if we're gonna switch instead of levers to put nose pokes, so it's basically the same response all the time. So they choose that way, but also they can nose poke in when the food is coming, and we can actually track if during the waiting time when the queue is on, they're actually sign tracking and goal tracking, if we can correlate that to what's going on. That's exactly the question that we have, and next year I should have an answer for you.
Thanks. There are only studies showing that if you put animals in an enriched environment, they have more positive expectations in general, and they will perceive ambiguous stimuli as more positive. Do you think that relates to the information-seeking decisions? That is, they're maybe expecting the information to be more positive?
Ooh.
and that relates to their information-seeking frequency?
I think there is something about feeling safe, or there is a level that the rats are very socialized to humans. They know when they're put in a new environment, or they might know that that's a safe space, that nothing bad's gonna happen to them. That rats are less socialized might not. But I will have to think how to quantify that with the rats. But I think that's a very intriguing idea that I haven't actually explored. Thank you.
Okay, so about your maze experiment, so the result there was that rats that don't like the open maze, they are the biggest information seekers. Is that right? Did I
So
have that?
the ones that spend more time in the open, which is usually in the elevator plus maze, spending more time in the open is considered, or spending more time in the closed arms, where you're protected, is considered higher levels of anxiety.
Right.
And what we found is that the rats that spend less time in the closed arms, so less anxiety-like behavior, were the ones that prefer information the least. So more information. If they prefer information, they were less anxious.
They're less anxious. Okay. Okay, I got that backward. Yeah, there's a double negative there. Thanks for
Yeah,
setting,
sorry.
setting it straight. Okay.
But
thanks.
it's a little bit, it's the opposite of what we were expecting. So we were expecting that animals that were more anxious were going to seek information more because they're trying to assess what's going on with the environment, and that's not what we found.
Well, I wonder. I mean, but this actually support what you found is more consistent with curiosity. So in my view, the curiosity part is the actually willingness to expose yourself to uncertainty in order to reduce it. And so I would expect someone who's less fearful would be more willing to expose themselves to uncertainty.
I tried to convince the other animal people of that.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to tell you guys about a project with a postdoc I'm working with, Kara Kedrick. She's here also. She'll be talking later this afternoon about some more of her work. We're interested in how people come up with explanations and how they explore ideas to come up with explanations. And generally, we're interested in how do people make sense of the world. Right? What happens is we become aware of a puzzle, and with this information gap, we ask a question and we become curious, and so we can search for information out in the world. We can also think harder about ideas that are already in our head and try to come up with something internally to explain away this puzzle. And so in a lot of the work I've done previously on curiosity, we're thinking about how does our attention to different information gaps drive our curiosity to find those answers. And what I'll tell you about today, we're thinking about how does our attention to different parts of the semantic space drive our exploration in that semantic space as we try to form an explanation. Clearly, explanations are essential for navigating the world around us. We see this in our kind of daily lives, like why is it that my car won't start? Or in our social lives, like why is my friend upset? So it's really important to be able to come up with explanations to know how to act adaptively. We also see this, the value of explanations in advancing science. Why did a pandemic start was something that a lot of people were interested in just a few years ago. But more generally, scientific progress is made by trying to explain the phenomena that we can observe. And so there's a long line of research on the value of explanation for scientific progress. In a lot of cases, where we come up with explanations is from other people. But what I want to focus on today is where do those explanations come from in the first place? So how do people form new explanations in situations where they don't know what the answer is already? Maybe they've never been exposed to a hypothesis about this. There's a fair bit of work already on explanation selection. So if you're given some candidate explanations, we know a bit about how people decide which is a better explanation, which one they're going to endorse. So there's work on explanatory virtues and people prefer simpler explanations. They prefer explanations that make sense of more of what they can observe. But what we're going to focus on now is, where do these explanations come from in the first place? How do people come up with this candidate set? And we think that's been understudied until now. And in particular, it's important how people come up with this candidate set of explanations, because we don't think that people search through the full set of plausible explanations. So you could imagine a computer, an AI, could just search through everything and then use these explanatory virtues to choose the best one, and it wouldn't matter how you came up with a set in the first place. But people have bounded ability to reason through real-world problems, and so they're going to only come up with a small subset of the possible explanations, and the ones that they come up with may affect what they settle on. And I think a classic example of this from history is the case of what causes scurvy. This was a huge problem in the 18th century because sailors would come down with scurvy, and it was a horrible disease. We're talking about their teeth and hair falling out. Eventually, it would lead to death for many sailors. And so this was something that all sailors were really thinking about: what can we do to avoid scurvy? And James Lind in 1747 actually had one of the very first randomized controlled experiments to try to figure out how can we prevent scurvy. And so one set of hypotheses at the time was that scurvy was caused by the internal putrefaction or internal decay of bodily organs. And so they thought, let's try to give people some different treatments and see if we can prevent that decay. Give them hard cider, give them vinegar, give them elixir of vitriol, give them seawater, maybe that would help. Or they thought maybe scurvy is caused by some kind of digestive issues, so give them this medicinal paste, or maybe it's caused by diet, so give them a couple of oranges and a lemon. And of course, we now know that that's going to work. So the lemon prevented people from getting scurvy, and great, we've figured out the cause. Except we haven't quite gotten an explanation, right? We've identified that lemon juice stops scurvy, but we don't know why it stops scurvy. And so thinking about this, okay, the lemons work. If you had thought about diet and if you knew about vitamins, maybe you would have known that the correct explanation here is that scurvy is caused by an absence of vitamin C. But at the time, Lind didn't even have this hypothesis available to him. And so when he thought that he found this evidence that lemons are preventing scurvy, he thought maybe this is related to digestive issues. He thought that actually there was a whole thing about like blocked sweat glands were part of this, and that the acid in lemon would kind of unblock the sweat glands. And so he had the wrong explanation of what was going on here, and that meant that he didn't actually know how to continue to prevent scurvy. He thought maybe we should just boil the lemon juice to reduce it to a concentrate, at which point boiling kills a lot of the vitamin C. Later on, sailors thought maybe you could use lime juice instead, which still has some vitamin C, but when you boil it and you leave it exposed to air in copper pots, it stopped working. And so even though they discovered what cured scurvy in the 1700s, still early 20th century, sailors were dying of scurvy, and they stopped believing that lemons would prevent scurvy, and they went back to some of these other explanations. They learned about bacteria, and they thought maybe there's this bacteria that's causing scurvy, and it was just the fresh fruit was helping to prevent getting that bacteria into your system in the first place. And so it wasn't until later in the 20th century that they actually learned about animal studies where they could figure out that they could identify exactly what vitamin was the source here, and that vitamin C was the necessary ingredient here. So having the wrong explanation meant that even when you knew what caused scurvy, you didn't really know in an actionable way enough to prevent scurvy for the next couple hundred years. So you could imagine, how does somebody come up with this set of possible explanations? And maybe they're thinking about things related to internal decay in the body, and they're thinking, okay, there's this toxic buildup that's leading to this corruption of bodily tissues. Or they're thinking about these digestive issues. They're thinking maybe there's this imbalance in digestive humors, poor absorption of nutrients. If they never consider things like deficiency of a vitamin, then they're going to settle on an explanation that's not really going to be useful. Let's go through that. So generally, we want to know, how do people come up with explanations? We want to think about an explanation as connecting existing concepts in a new way. And so generating an explanation involves navigating this kind of conceptual space. How do you identify what concepts you're going to try to invoke to piece together an explanation? And what we think is that there's a process of associative reasoning that may go on as people are trying to piece together these concepts. We know that people use associative reasoning for all kinds of cognitive tasks, like memory recall, judgment and decision making, problem solving. And the hallmark of using associative reasoning is that these cognitive processes are context dependent, so that cues in the environment, framing of the situation, affect what comes to mind. And in the context of memory recall, it affects what you remember. In the context of decision making, it affects the decision that you make. In the context of problem solving, it affects how you try to solve that problem. We're going to ask, does the same thing happen when people are trying to generate an explanation? Are they affected by the salience of different cues, in this case, in the questions that they're asking? So we want to ask, generally, can the framing of a question influence the explanations that people come up with? And specifically, are there, if there are salient words in that question, do those salient words direct the explanations that people come up with, so that people are exploring different parts of the semantic space based on which words in the question are more salient? So just to give you a motivating example, this was one of the words we used in our study, and one of the stimuli we used in our study. We asked the question, why are some planets solid while others are gaseous? And you can imagine somebody who's confronted with this question for the first time, no idea about how this actually works, and you start thinking, how do I come up with a possible explanation for this? And maybe you start by thinking about the planets that you can think of that are solid, like Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. Okay, these are planets that are close to the sun. That means that they're exposed to more heat. Maybe if they're hot, then the gases can kind of escape, and that's why the planets are solid. Or you think, but maybe these are also smaller planets, so they have weaker gravitational pull, and so that's why the gas can escape. Or maybe you start thinking about the gaseous planets, like Jupiter, Saturn, and you think, well, these are planets that are farther from the sun, so they're colder, and that causes the gases to kind of settle and to be retained. Or maybe you think that these are planets that are larger, so they have stronger gravity, so that's what's holding on to all the gas. So depending on which part of this question you focus on, you might think more about explanations in terms of the planets that are solid, or more about explanations in terms of planets that are gaseous, to try to understand this dichotomy. Or you might think about abstracting away from specific examples and think about something at a higher level, like it's formation location that matters, or maybe it's the size of the planet and the gravity that matters. And so what we are hypothesizing is going to happen is that how you ask this question can affect which explanations you come up with initially, and then there may be a dynamic process where which explanations you come up with initially affect how you continue to reason and continue to come up with additional explanations. And so maybe you go down a path as you try to explore this space. So we're going to ask people questions like this, and we want to evaluate, are their answers more similar to one of two keywords in the question. So in this case, the two keywords are solid and gaseous. We want to ask, is a particular explanation that somebody comes up with closer to solid, were they thinking about that word, or closer to gaseous, were they thinking more about that word? And so if somebody gave the answer, solid planets are small with weak gravity, we'd identify that as an explanation that's more semantically similar to solid. If they give the answer that gaseous planets are large with strong gravity, both answers that are about the size and the gravity of the planet, but that second one is more semantically similar to gaseous. We're going to ask, do salient words in this question direct semantic exploration? So are people directed more towards word answers related to planets that are solid or towards planets that are gaseous in this particular question? We're going to first try to manipulate the word order in this question and see does that manipulation affect what kind of explanations people come up with? When we manipulate word order in that way, that may also affect how surprising it is to come across that word at that point in the question. Perhaps how surprising it is could be what affects what kind of explanations people come up with. And also, the words themselves may have some natural variation in how salient they are to people based on how familiar people are with those words. So we want to look at how does the familiarity of those words affect the explanations that people come up with. So we have three key hypotheses here. When we manipulate the word order, we're going to take a question like, why are some planets solid while others are gaseous, and rephrase that as, why are some planets gaseous while others are solid, and see when you rephrase the question that way, does the word that shows up first attract more attention and kind of attract explanations that are closer to that word? We then are going to calculate how surprising is a word when it appears at that point in the context of that question, using GPT-2. And GPT-2 will give you the probability that any word comes after a string of words up until that point. And so we're just going to identify surprise as the inverse of that probability. We're going to take the log of it, so negative log probability for the surprisal of that word at that point in the sentence. And then to get a measure of the familiarity of a word, we're going to use a database of subtitles from movies just to get a sense of like how common is this word in the kind of typical usage. So a word like solid appears pretty frequently, and a word like gaseous appears much less frequently. And so our first hypothesis is going to be that the word that appears first is going to attract more explanations that are closer to that word. So we think there's going to be a bit of like a primacy effect here, and that it's just a bit more salient when it comes up first. Our second hypothesis is going to be that when the word is more surprising, when it shows up in context, that's going to attract more attention, and people may come up with explanations that are closer to the word that's more surprising. When you ask the question the first way, both words are pretty close in surprisingness, and when you change the order of the words, why are some planets gaseous? Gaseous is very surprising. That's not what you expect. Then while others are solid, at that point you kind of know where the question is going. So maybe your attention is drawn to gaseous much more than solid in this second phrasing than in the first phrasing. So this could potentially be a mechanism for that first word order effect if we find it. And then familiarity, obviously solid is a pretty familiar word to people, gaseous much less so. So maybe people are just drawn to solid because it's a more familiar word. So we're going to ask a bunch of CMU alumni, 6 of 12 possible why questions in our stimulus set. Ask them to just come up with as many possible explanations as they can come up with. We're then going to try to measure the semantic similarity of the explanations they come up with, the similarity to each of these 2 keywords in the question. And we're going to do this in 3 ways. I'm primarily going to focus today on just one of those measures, which is just asking GPT to rate the semantic similarity between the word and the explanation that they came up with. But we also do this with word embeddings and with sentence transformers, and I'll show you some of those results. But mostly I'll focus on the GPT model. So just to give you a sense of how GPT rates these, for solid planets are small with weak gravity, GPT gives that a similarity of 80 to the word solid. For gaseous planets are large with strong gravity, GPT gives that a similarity of 20 to the word solid. And so this kind of shows our word order effect. This is the distribution of explanations with different semantic similarities to the keyword, whether it's the first keyword or the second keyword. We see that there's a lot of explanations that are pretty similar to keywords, and especially so when you're looking at the similarity to the first keyword. There's also a lot of explanations that are not so similar to one of these keywords, and especially so when you're looking at similarity to the second keyword. So we can just see distributionally here that you're getting answers that are kind of shifted to be more similar to the first keyword than the second keyword. We can also look at how the difference in surprisal between the two keywords or the difference in familiarity between the two keywords affects the difference in the rated semantic similarity of the explanation to each of those two keywords. This picture makes it look like surprisal has an effect here. That's actually not significant when we do the statistical analysis, but we do see an effect from familiarity here also. So here's just the full results from the regression. The GPT model in blue shows very clear effect from the word order manipulation. Whichever word is first, you get explanations that are closer to that word. There's no significant effect from surprisal there. In fact, only one of the models has a significant effect for surprisal, and it's in the opposite of our predicted direction. But if it's just one of the three models, we might think that's noise. And then we do see that familiarity has an effect here also. That's showing up in 2 out of the 3 models, where the more familiar the word is, the more explanations are closer to that word. We can then look at the dynamic effects. So having just given one explanation, how does that affect the subsequent explanation that somebody comes up with? And we see that, that there's people tend to stick with the same topic. So that having already given an explanation related to planets being solid, the next explanation you come up with is more likely to again be related to planets being solid, or vice versa. If your first one was gaseous, you're more likely to stick with explanations that are being gaseous. We can also see that as you come up with additional explanations, the semantic similarity becomes less dependent on which word appeared first in the question. So that word order effect is weakening as people come up with more and more explanations, and it seems like instead they're mostly staying on topic. Can kind of show you the staying on topic with this transition network, where we can just categorize explanations by, is that explanation closer to the first keyword, closer to the second keyword, or both equally? And we see most transitions, maybe not always quite a majority, but much more than random, stick with the same focus from one explanation to the next. So there's this kind of stickiness to the explanations that people come up with. So generally, we interpret these results to tell us that the way that people come up with explanations is influenced by context. We think it's these salient words in the question are attracting your attention to different ideas and then are affecting the way that you explore the semantic space. And so we find that the words that appear earlier in the question, words that are more familiar, are attracting your attention, and that this is not being driven by the surprisingness of the words in context. So I'll take some questions. Thank you.
So I don't know if this would be that interesting, but when you're talking about the explanations, divergent kind of thinking, or do you think that there would actually be kind of individual differences, the same way there is in divergent thinking to the explanations being similar, or is this like a different phenomenon, I guess, a different cognitive process that's going on?
I don't have data to show you about individual differences, but certainly my intuition would be considerable individual differences here.
Yeah.
And in large part because like our measures of salience here are pretty weak, right? So for a particular person, what's salient to them could be not very well captured by a fairly weak word order manipulation or how familiar this word is in the movies in general. So, and then there's probably lots of additional individual differences in just like how creative somebody is when they're trying to come up with these explanations versus like how focused they are on a specific topic.
Just one more question for just the age differences, actually, because you would see that differences in type of thinking, but I would also think people with older that have more experiences, so they might have access to more explanations. So what would you, I guess, predict for age-wise differences?
Again, no data to inform this, but if you ask me to make a prediction, I think that people get maybe locked in a little bit more as they get older. And so I think that maybe they're gonna, I think this would be both based on the experience they've had, like maybe some of these concepts is just like where they're gonna focus, and it's gonna be harder to switch between them.
All right,
But
thank you.
Just naive guess.
I appreciate it.
Hi, Russell. Thank you for your excellent talk. So I have two questions. So one is specific to your talk. I remember you showed a paired example of different explanation towards the word solely, right? But the GPT score actually shows very different. But I was wondering, because the semantic meaning of that two sentences are actually almost the same, maybe it's just because of different order. So I'm thinking about whether the GPT score differs. It is just simply because the first word in that sentence is quite different. So the embedding is quite influenced by the context word, but not actually exactly the different semantic space. Yeah. The second question is more generally extension from your talk. So I guess you have exhibit some key factors that addresses how our mental exploration, just generate explanations. But more generally, just extending to our experimental tasks, just like decision-making tasks, or maybe economic games, or maybe risky decision-making or learning. So they are much more like thought level, just like we have different strategies, we have different thought processes. So I'm curious of what's your insights that how we can understand the thoughts level, some computational or algorithmic principles in exploration in the reasoning in this kind of tasks.
So the first part of the question is, like, what is GPT picking up on when it makes these semantic similarity judgments for us? And the second part of the question is, looking beyond these tasks, like how do we kind of capture the way that people explore these different environments?
Yep. Yeah.
So I think we're still learning what GPT is doing. So I'm not sure, but I think my best understanding of it is that it's doing a reasonable approximation of what people are doing, that it's trying to learn to do what people would do. And so I think there's a variety of cues that it could be picking up on, that like the word that's first in the sentence could clearly be part of that. But I think it's remarkably good at kind of picking up on all these cues, and I don't think it's like a simple heuristic. And then for the context beyond like this particular kind of exploration generation, I think that's really wide open for researcher. Like part of what motivated this project was seeing some work on like how do people come up with possible alternatives that they're choosing between. And so initially we were thinking about this as like when you come up with different explanations, you're then maybe evaluating them and deciding how curious are you to keep searching. And we thought this was like a first step in this path of like how do you even model what people are coming up with in the first place.
Thank you so much.
I have a question. Do you have any thoughts about how to use this as an application? If I was an educator and I would want to guide my students into better explanation?
We do have some thoughts on that, and I think this is something that's going to need more research also, but like I think there's a couple ways you can interpret it. One that I kind of caution against is trying to figure out what's the right way to ask the question to generate good explanations, because I don't think there is a right way to do it, but I think what this does suggest is that if you can ask a question in multiple different ways, then you're going to prompt people to think about the question differently. And so I think that good pedagogy is often asking the same question in multiple different ways to get people to think about it from different perspectives, to activate different kinds of concepts that might come to mind for them. So it still needs to be tested, but the hypothesis I would have coming out of this is that if you can ask people to rephrase a question, that can help generate more expansive thinking about how to answer it.
Thank you for a great talk.
So we're going to start with a couple of contributed talks, and then we're going to have a couple blitz talks. So first up is Ethan Bromberg-Martin, and I'll just let you go right ahead.
Thank you very much. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ethan Bromberg-Martin, a scientist in the Monosov lab, and today I'm excited to show you our new theoretical framework to investigate why we and other species, like this monkey, evolved the remarkable behavior of valuing abstract incentives like seeking information about the future, and why we can value them for their own sake, assigning them subjective value even when they have no tangible instrumental value for us. This is a detailed story we've been brewing for a decade, so I've done my best to kind of compress the highlights into this talk time. So the specific form of info-seeking we study here is our desire for knowledge about future rewards. This has been studied in psychology and economics since the 1950s. So when I was a grad student, I wanted to uncover how this desire was created by neurons in the brain. So I came up with a task to test if monkeys seek this information. I gave monkeys a simple choice between two options. Both gave exactly the same uncertain reward outcomes, a 50-50 chance of a big or a small water reward. However, if they chose one option, the informative option, they got to see an informative cue whose shape told them in advance whether they're getting a big or a small water reward. If they chose the other non-informative option, they got randomized non-informative cues that didn't tell the monkey anything and left them waiting in a state of uncertainty. We found monkeys had a strong, persistent preference to choose info, even though this info was non-instrumental in the sense that the monkeys couldn't use it to influence the outcome in any way, but the monkeys still persistently assigned it high subjective value. Over the last 15 years, using tasks like this, I and many others from many labs in this very room have been uncovering the neural computations that create this desire for info, and I'm so excited to see it all. But I've always been a little unsatisfied by one limitation of our conventional studies. You know, suppose we fully uncover the computational and neural basis of subjective value. Suppose we know everything about how our brains create this preference. That still wouldn't answer the most fundamental question about information seeking to me. Why? Why should brains implement these computations? Why should we place subjective value on this information when it has no instrumental value? You know, I've watched monkeys do tasks like this for literally hundreds of thousands of trials, and they persistently choose info and even pay for it when they have the chance. They give up huge amounts of real, tangible, physical rewards for no tangible benefit. And a lot of humans do it too. So why? In our work I'll show today, we take one early step toward answering this question by proposing an evolution-inspired framework for investigating the origin of subjective value. As Dobzhansky famously said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So indeed, if I plot information choice from a number of data sets across 6 species, it looks conserved across a chunk of the tree of life, including every mammal and avian species tested as far as I know. While reportedly it's absent in a species outside this clade in work by Victor Adjouan and colleagues in goldfish. So, could an evolutionary process have created non-instrumental information seeking? This is a question I've been grappling with for a long time. Way back in my PhD thesis I wrote, we can explain info seeking in 2 ways. First, animals may have simply evolved to be bad at calculating information's instrumental value, so the subjective value we put on it is just a bug in the reward system. But second, animals may be very good at calculating information's instrumental value, but not its value in our lab experiments. Instead, information's value in the natural environments where those animals evolved. To see how a theory like this would work, I'll touch on a well-accepted case where evolution creates subjective value without instrumental value. And that's the reward of sweet taste. Humans, monkeys, mice, and many other animals have a sweet tooth. They pay for saccharin, which is sweet but has no nutrients, 0 calories. So why don't they eventually learn that saccharin doesn't give nutrients and lose their preference? The conventional view is that sweet is a natural cue to sugar in the environments these species evolved. So evolution created the sweet tooth as a tool to guide them to successful behavior in nature. That's a compelling explanation for why species like humans and mice have a sweet tooth, but not obligate carnivores like cats that have low sugar diets. So I'm going to argue that the same may be also the case for info seeking. Info about future rewards in our lab tasks, it's like saccharin. It gives no nutrients, it has no instrumental value. But in some natural environment, info about future rewards really does help you get better outcomes. It has instrumental value, and that's why we evolved to give it subjective value tuned to its utility in nature. That's the theory. Now, how do we test this? We don't have access to the real ancient evolutionary environment. But we can still theorize and we can model it. We can model different naturalistic environments, derive the factors that govern their true instrumental value of info, and then ask, are these the same factors the brain uses to govern the subjective value of info in the lab? If there's a match between model and data, it suggests our info value in our brains may have evolved for that model type of environment. So let's formalize our framework, not just for the special case of info seeking, but general framework to investigate the origin of any abstract incentive. Call it incentive X. For some X that organisms assign subjective value without instrumental value, first, propose different theories of different natural environments where X has instrumental value. 2, implement the theories with models of reward maximizing agents in naturalistic environments. And then 3, test the models against data. Does the instrumental value of X in the model predict the subjective value of X in real organisms, across species and across task conditions? And we can use the models to derive novel, never-before-done experimental tests where the theories will make maximally dissociable predictions to test them even further. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'll apply our framework to the case of info. What evolutionary theories have been proposed for the origin of info seeking? Way back in my thesis, I proposed 2 problems in natural environments that info could help solve. First, optimizing time allocation in foraging, and second, helping solve the famous temporal credit assignment problem in reinforcement learning. When I was at Columbia, I teamed up with Josh Merrill to develop models for these 2 theories. And now, a decade later, we finally have data to test them. So let's start with time allocation theory. And I want to note, our model of this theory comes from the same underlying intuition as this insightful work by Vasconcelos and colleagues, including further work from Valeria, who's here in the audience today. And our results are aligned. The basic idea is simple. I'm going to represent our task in this simple scheme. Choose info or no info, get a Q, get the outcome. Info has no instrumental value. But in this lab task, there was only one action on each trial, choose info or no info, and after that, all you can do is passively wait for the outcome. But in natural environments and in optimal foraging theory, when you're pursuing a potential reward, you don't have to wait. If the reward doesn't look good enough to be worth your time, you can abandon it. You can leave at any time. So to model this, we'll make a model environment that we'll call the leavable info task, exactly the same as the standard task, but you're allowed to leave the trial at any time and move on to the inter-trial interval immediately. So if you enter a trial, look around, and get the good news a big reward is available, sure, stay and get it. But if you get the bad news, only a small reward is available, you don't have to stay, you can leave immediately and save a bunch of time. So of course, in this leavable info task, info has high instrumental value. And we can easily calculate that instrumental value of information in this model environment, just as the improvement in reward rate if an optimal agent always chooses info versus if the same agent always chooses no info. So that's time allocation theory. Next, secondly, we theorize info could also help solve the temporal credit assignment problem in reinforcement learning. That is, after you get a reward, which of your actions deserves the credit for producing that reward? We propose info helps this in natural environments specifically that have 3 key ingredients: reinforcement learning, temporal credit assignment problem, and informative cues. So I'll build up our simple model by introducing these one by one. First, reinforcement learning. We model a simple, standard, dynamic reinforcement learning task. On each trial, the agent chooses an action A from a set of actions and gets a reward R. The action values change randomly over trials, so the agent has to do continual learning to maximize reward. Very standard. Next, we add credit assignment. Because in a typical lab task, as a single action and a single outcome, but in natural environments, learning is much harder because a single reward can be influenced by many other, what I'll call background events, other actions by the agent, because we're continually taking many actions over time, actions by other agents who might be competing for a reward, hidden states of the environment and events we can't observe. All those can also influence the reward, which creates a credit assignment problem, because the agent only sees this total reward R. So how much credit deserves to go to this action for the reward versus to those background events, the background noise? And you've all experienced this, right? Times when you think, did I get a big reward because I chose a good action, or did I choose a bad action but got bailed out by lucky background circumstances? So to model the background noise as simply as possible, we just add Gaussian noise to the reward at each time step, with the noise magnitude ramping up to the time of the reward to follow the classic contiguity principle that events close in time to the reward tend to have a larger influence. Okay. So finally, we add info cues to help solve this problem. So just like in our task, an informative cue comes at a time in between the action and the outcome and indicates how much reward has been caused so far. That is the sum of the reward from the action, RA, and the reward from all background events before the cue. So that's that area in red, R background pre-cue. But importantly, the cue isn't psychic, so it isn't influenced by events that come after it. That's in blue, R BG post-cue. And this is the key benefit of info seeking. The Q is actually a more reliable indicator of the action's value than the reward itself is. Because if you look at those arrows, let's see if I can get the pointer here. It's really hard to point like this. Well, I'll just describe it. Both C and R are influenced by the action through the reward it produced RA. But the Q is only affected by that red part of the background noise, the pre-Q part, while the reward is influenced by all of the background events until the time of the reward. So the info Q is actually a better teaching signal because it has less noise. Okay, so with our theories and models in hand, let's test them against data. We used a data set from our recent study where we measured the subjective value of info in experiments, that's SVOIX written up there, using analogous tasks across species in both humans and monkeys. And we measured their info values as functions of many different motivational factors. I'll show some key ones on the left here. For example, we found both species increased info value with reward uncertainty, that's UNCR, more so than they did with expected reward, that's ER. Further, we found that both species increased info value with a specific mathematical form of uncertainty resembling standard deviation, that black theoretical curve on the left there, as opposed to other theorized uncertainty measures like range or entropy, which are those colored theoretical curves on the left. And both species also increased info value with early timing. The earlier the info came in advance of the reward, the more they valued that info. Okay. So that's the data. How about the models? So on the right, I'm going to plot whether each theory matched these data. And I was amazed by the result I'm about to show you, because I want to stress there are a lot of possible results we could have found here comparing the models to data. We could have found that the time allocation model predicts everything better. Or we could have found the credit assignment model predicts everything better. Or we could have found that each theory predicts different parts of info value. Or we could have found that some parts of info value aren't predicted by either theory. Right? Those are many things we could have found. But this is what we actually got. The most surprising result to me, that both theories that value info for totally different purposes and different algorithms still predicted all these specific detailed features of real info value computations in both humans and monkeys, suggesting the brain may have somehow evolved one subjective value computation that's pretty good at solving both problems. So here's what the plots look like. And you can see it clearly. Both theories make very similar predictions. Big effect of reward uncertainty, bigger than the effect of expected reward, similar mathematical form of the uncertainty measure, and similar effect of information timing, matching both humans and monkeys. Okay, so finally, since both of the theories match the existing data remarkably well, can we use our framework to derive different predictions to dissociate the theories from each other in future experiments? And the answer is yes, and we want to test it. So here's the intuition. Each theory gets value from different parts of the information. The time allocation theory is about deciding to stay or leave. So all it cares about is the part of the info that says, do I get more reward from staying or leaving? But the credit assignment theory is about learning action values. So all it cares about is the part of the info that says, was my action a good or bad value? So if I do a simulation where I give each model just the small part of the info it cares about, the models extract just as much information value as if I give it the normal full info telling the exact reward size. While conversely, each model does significantly worse if I give it the other part of the info it doesn't care about. So that's, you see on the left, the purple curve, the purple bar matches the black. On the right, the green bar matches the black. So I think this is amazing. For the first time, we may be able to do an experiment in real organisms where different theories for the origin of info seeking are known to make different predictions. So I'm looking forward to it. So I want to thank my co-authors, my grant support, and all of you in the audience. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, yes. Hi, great talk as usual. My question is, I know there is one paper that tried to do the living or staying with pigeons.
Yes.
And they actually found it really hard for the pigeons to, well, it was hard to train them to learn to leave.
Yes.
Do you expect, what do you expect the monkeys are going to do in that sense? And if you know, what would you think it will be different from pigeons without saying that pigeons are
Yeah.
stupider than?
Yeah, no, that I found that paper so fascinating because it was sort of like they had to find the right situation where the pigeon was doing things. But I think part of it might be that in the natural environment, the way pigeons would usually leave might actually be to fly away instead of staying in sort of the experimental box. So that may be part of it as well. But also, one thing I haven't had time to show is another part of this project. So one question we had is, in a natural environment, you often don't know how much credit assignment versus time allocation are important in your current situation. So you might need to put value on info based on some combination of those both. And if we did the simulations, it turns out what tends to do best is actually a rule that's like a mixture of the two. If you specialize in one rule, you do really good at, say, temporal credit assignment, but then you do really bad at the other. And a mixture gets a little bit of best of both worlds. So that may explain this where, they may not fully actually leave as you would predict by the theory, but they do it partially, and similar for the credit assignment.
Thank you.
That was a wonderfully clear presentation.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'll be very curious about what you find with this research. My question is, my guess is you'll find both things. And because both of
Yes.
these things actually objectively matter, but does that tell you, can you kind of finish the circle and say that that shows you that that's the reason that information seeking evolved? I mean, you can show that these two things matter, and I think you probably will. But how do you then?
Well, there's a couple parts to it. So. One way of thinking about it is there's many different factors that organisms could use to govern their info seeking, but each of these theories makes particular predictions about particular patterns for how you combine these different factors to compute subjective value in some situations. So in that sense, they're not the only possibilities. There's many other rules animals could use. So if we find that what animals do happens to match one of them pretty well, that's suggestive that that may have had some influence over it, even in the absence of other evidence. But sort of more importantly, I'd say what I'd really like to do, and part of the reason we're doing this whole thing with theories and modeling is because not only can we not measure the ancient evolutionary environment, we can't even really measure much about the information landscapes of modern natural environments for different organisms. And even for humans, there's people in this room who are now working on that, and it's very difficult, and we're only beginning to do that as a field. So if there's a way we could measure the information landscapes of environments for different organisms and show, this organism has to do a lot of time allocation decisions, but not so much credit assignment. This one does a lot of credit assignment, but not time allocation. Then that would make a strong prediction according to this theory. Then if we look at their information seeking, it'll use one algorithm versus the other. So that's something I'd like to test. And that might also explain why in Victor's study, the goldfish weren't showing a preference in that case, because maybe in their natural environment, they can't use it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and next we have Kara Kedrick.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kara Kedrick, and today I'm going to be talking to you about some research I've been working on that involves creative foraging and the explore-exploit trade-off. So right now you're looking at this kind of network representation, and I want you to imagine it as our collective knowledge. So imagine it as a network of artifacts we produce, and so each node could potentially be some kind of scientific article or maybe a web page. And we can think of them as being linked through various means. So they may cover similar concepts, and so they're linked in that way, or they could reference one another, or maybe someone linked them as they were searching for an answer. And so oftentimes we find ourselves with the need to kind of query the environment for an answer. For example, one question maybe some of you asked about the conference is, well, who organized it? So we can easily turn to our collective knowledge by doing some kind of a Google search to find the conference's website and the list of organizers. And I would say that this kind of task of finding the list of organizers didn't involve a lot of creativity. So we were able to find the answer to our question on a single web page without fiddling with it, without modifying it so that without creating something new or novel to answer this question. However, consider this question. So how will LLMs reshape the job market? Now, this is a bit trickier. We can't just pull a single page from a Google search or online that will give us an answer to this question. Instead, we may search for somewhat relevant information to try to cobble together an answer. For example, we might search the history of technology, look to see how the advent of ATMs reshaped the banking workforce. We may alternatively look at organizational adaptation, so how do organizations tend to adapt to new inventions? Or we may think about, okay, what do we know about human skills, human capital? How can it complement LLMs? So I would define this context as being relatively more creative. You can't just find the answer online. You must visit various different sites, maybe read different articles to try to cobble together, create, or invent some kind of answer to this question. And so for this project, we were really interested in answering this question, how do people search through information as they create an original perspective? And so the creativity in information-seeking literature is quite rich. And so a lot of research tends to focus on creativity as studied through semantic search. So that means studying, what's happened, like creativity as it occurs in your mind. So you search your memory for related information, and it tends to be studied in terms of individual differences. So we can say some people are very creative. When I ask them to generate animals, they come up with seahorse and dolphin or something unexpected. And so we tend to think about some people as generating more novel, distal connections, while other people tend to arrive at very common concepts or common conceptual combinations. And so for this project, we're taking a different approach. We're really interested in studying creativity when it comes to exploring external sources. And instead of creativity being framed as an individual difference, it's being framed as generating something that deviates from the information you are exposed to. So it deviates from what you have read. You can't just regurgitate an answer from someone. So that would be a very creative situation. And so for this study, we focused on foraging for information online. And we were really interested in terms of how these kind of creative contexts that I've described can influence exploration and exploitation. And we were particularly inspired by the information foraging literature that focuses on exploration and exploitation in terms of searching through a patch of food or information. And so in this context, when we search online, we can think of patches as maybe web pages, Wikipedia pages, that all pertain to a similar topic. They may have distinct concepts that they mention, but we can kind of classify them as being similar in some way. And so exploitation in this context can be thought of as exhausting a patch by looking at web pages about concepts that fall within the same topic. So web pages that are highly semantically similar. And I have this kind of visual up here, this schematic of what this may look like. So let's say you start on page A. And going back to the example I mentioned earlier, let's say you exploit this patch of history of technology. So you might just visit all these pages in this patch. This black arrow is meant to indicate I'm reading these pages. So that's how we can think about exploitation. Exploration can be thought of as jumping between these patches. And these patches can be quite different from each other. So for example, I might jump to the organizational adaptation patch, then to this human capital patch. And as you can see, if you look at these black arrows, I've kind of created this network of the pages that that people may visit. And we can use this network to measure exploration, exploitation, and the trade-off between the two. So we have a few different hypotheses. Our first hypothesis is that in these high creativity conditions, we're going to see more exploration. So this would be people jumping to very disparate patches. And I have kind of an illustration of this here. So imagine each node is a website, Wikipedia page. And so when the distance between them is long, that means that they're quite different from each other. And so here in this network, this is kind of a schematic illustration of what that may look like. The thick line is meant to represent the sequence of nodes you visit, and as you can see, they're quite different from each other. And there's a lot of evidence supporting that exploration in this format would be associated with kind of the creation of novel ideas. So relatedly, we can maybe think that in this low creativity condition, this would involve more exploitation. So people may visit like semantically similar pages. Here I have another schematic illustration of this. As I've used before, this kind of gray circle is meant to indicate that these pages are in a cluster. They're quite similar to each other. And as you can see here, there's all these different gray clusters. Also, the edges between the clusters are a lot shorter than the edges over here, so maybe the clusters themselves are even similar to each other. And there's evidence, again, supporting this, so exploitation is thought to be the best strategy for solving a problem when an individual can employ established principles. So we also had a different hypothesis, alternative to the two that I just mentioned, which is that in the high creativity condition, we'll see people trading off, or when the task is creative, we'll see people trading off more between exploration and exploitation. So with the schematic over here, as you can see, I have these clusters, clear clusters, but the kind of jumps between them are much longer. So maybe people are visiting like very distinct clusters that differ very much from each other. Maybe they take a deep dive into one topic, understand it well, before jumping to a really different, diverse topic. And we see this in some of the literature. Hart et al. 2017 had this kind of creative foraging task, and what they found is that participants tended to exploit a certain type of novel shape configuration they were creating before exploring to create a new type of shape configuration. Okay, so what did we do? We created this knowledge foraging task. We had 138 participants, and they're asked to answer 4 questions based on information they found while browsing Wikipedia, and they were given 15 minutes per question. And as you can see here, this is a visual of the task. So it was a split screen. Half of the screen had the question, and then a text box where they could write their answer. The other half of the screen was Wikipedia, a cloned version of Wikipedia that they could search through, search key terms, hit hyperlinks, interact with it as they developed their answer. And so we had a low creativity condition where the information they sought could be easily retrieved from Wikipedia. Unlike the simple example I led with about the who organized the conference, these questions tended to involve multiple pages, so you could find relevant answers not only on one page, but multiple. An example of this is how do species survive exceptionally harsh conditions? And so over here, I have just kind of an illustration of how a person may have gone about answering this question. So as they're thinking through, they may have thought, okay, let me see how animals survive harsh winters. And so they may have visited Wikipedia pages on walruses, Arctic foxes to see, how they're able to survive these climates. So they might exploit this winter animals patch before jumping to desert animals and looking at how camels and meerkats survive extreme heat. And then potentially looking at deep sea animals, how they survive there. And so for the high creativity condition, we had participants answer questions where they couldn't really directly find the exact information they're looking for on Wikipedia pages. And so an example of this is what are the evolutionary consequences of species becoming increasingly connected through globalization? This is an open question. Experts don't have a conclusive answer. They couldn't necessarily find it on Wikipedia. So now a little bit about our measures. So we created multiple networks. We created a sequential network, which again is highlighted by this thick line over here. And the nodes were Wikipedia pages. The edges were if the participant visited them sequentially. And we weighted the edges with a semantic similarity measure, specifically the cosine similarity of TF-IDF vectors. And we also created a condition network, so we connected all pages the participants visited per condition. Again, the nodes are Wikipedia pages. The edges, if they visited them in the same condition, occurred, and then we weighted them again based on semantic similarity. And we have these two networks because our measures required these two networks, and I can go into more detail about that after the talk. So I'm going to focus on a couple of measures that we looked at. We looked at more than this. But to begin, so we looked at average edge weights on our sequential network. And so here, if the edge weights, you could think of it as if if the edge weights are higher, then that means that more exploitation is going on. That means the pages are more semantically similar. But if they're lower, that means the pages are different from each other. We also looked at the average clustering coefficient. So we can think of higher clustering as associated with exploitation. So what we ended up finding is that in the high creativity condition, this average edge weight was smaller, indicating that there was more exploration going on. We also found that in the high creativity condition, there was a higher clustering coefficient, which indicates that there's probably more exploitation. So what this suggests is that in this high creativity condition, people were trading off more between exploration and exploitation than they were in the low creativity condition. An additional analysis that we ran was in a way a validity check, but we wanted to confirm that the answers people generated deviated more from the text that they read than the other condition for the creativity condition. And what we found across a variety of semantic similarity analysis is that the text in the creative condition, the text in the creative condition differed more from the content in the Wikipedia pages that the participants read. So they developed more original responses. And so to briefly conclude, we see that people trade off between exploration and exploitation when tasked with generating creative answers. This may involve exploiting diverse patches of Wikipedia pages. And we still kind of don't know what exactly this means. There's a lot of future research in the works. It could be that they are synthesizing the patches that they're visiting. It could be that maybe they are exploring a particular hypothesis, rejecting it, turning to a new one. But what exactly is happening through this visitation of these patches and what information makes it into their their answer, is still a bit of an unknown. And so that's all I have for you today. Thank you for listening, and I want to thank my collaborators. And this is also the QR code with our preprint. So thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much for the nice talk and for sharing the beautiful data. I have a question regarding your definition of creativity. Because according to the standard definition, creativity is not only defined by unconventionality, but also by usefulness. And I see the point of unconventionality in your approach, but how do you assess the usefulness?
So that's a bit tricky. So what we've done actually, so in the high creativity condition, it's like we can't really gauge accuracy because the answer is not yet known. But what we did do is we excluded answers that were off topic. So that's our best bet. I mean, I think in the low creativity condition, we can for sure confirm accuracy, but accuracy in the high creativity condition is a bit harder. I don't know if you have any thoughts about how to go about scoring this accuracy, but no, I think that's a really good point. That's a really good point.
Thanks.
So I really liked that paradigm, and I wondered whether when you look at the answers they give at the end, you can figure out where they got the pieces of information that they're putting in their answer. So in particular, like the foraging analogy I was thinking about, like, the standard foraging of like local search until you're sort of not getting much anymore and then take a big jump, whether you could actually test for that in that their information content is sort of mostly from the first local search point, then it's sort of dropping as you move along.
No, that's a really good point. I've identified which sentence is the most similar to a sentence in the answer that they developed, but I haven't looked at when they kind of leave or, that's interesting. I haven't explored it. But I would kind of assume, at some point, if they don't get much from the paper, from the Wikipedia page, they would maybe leave the cluster. We did do some work with marginal value theorem, but it's kind of a little different in this context. But that's a good future direction. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, it's a really cool paradigm.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kara.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor for me to share my work today. I am Koyu from the University of Macau, and I'm currently a PhD candidate there. Today, my work named the dynamic integration of disposable value codes for reward and information in the human prefrontal cortex. So we know that the decision-making is a constant balancing act between the exploiting non-rewards and exploring for new information. And we all know that contemporary cognitive science recognizes that this information itself can be considered as a fundamental drive for, can be a fundamental motivator, and it holds intrinsic value, which can help us driving us curiosity and reducing uncertainty and our urges to minimizing the prediction errors within our own model of the world. And neurobiologically, studies have discovered some neural substrate that involved in processing information value that have been shared a lot today with the reward circuitry consistently implicated, and the role of dopamines in signaling the preference for the information value. Meanwhile, the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC, has also long been considered and involved in acquiring knowledge and the uncertainty reduction. However, what we want to ask is that while we have identified the individual neural codes for reward and information value, the dynamic mechanisms of how these dissociable value signals are actually integrated and dynamically weighted to orchestrate the flexible exploration and exploitation, this is still a major open question, and this is what we want to address. So to address this question, we used a paradigm that adapted from a previous gambling task. And in our current task, the participant will engage in 100 distinct games, and they will be required to making choices among 3 card decks. And each game will be structured into 2 critical phases. The first one is called a forced choice task, where the participant were asked to choose the pre-selected decks by the computer and learn the possible distribution. So the point is, in some games, the information was equal. The information was equal, which means each of the 3 decks will be sampled 2 times for the participant. And in some other games, the information was unequal, which means there will be 1 deck that will be sampled 4 times, and 1 will be sampled twice, and 1 will not be sampled. So following this, participant will enter a free choice phase, where they were asked to make a self-paced one-time decision to maximize their total points. And the reward means of these 3 decks will be stable within the game and will be varied across games. So to see the neural underpinnings, we recorded the intracranial EEG from 15 epilepsy patients, because the intracranial EEG can provide direct neural recording from deep brain structures and millisecond scale temporal resolution. So these advantages make it uniquely suited to investigate the direct regional insights. And in the current study, we chose the VMPFC and the anterior cingulate cortex as our regions for interest, because they've long been considered important in the information processing phase. So in order to capture how participants balance between reward and information, we used the gamma knowledge reinforcement learning model following the original paper. And this model extends the classic data learning rule by adding an information term. And the reward value of each deck will be updated using the traditional trial by trial standard prediction errors. And at the same time, the information value will be quantified as a function of how an option was sampled, and there will be a diminishing return for the repeated samples. So then these 2 signals will be combined and be transferred into a choice function using the softmax rule. Okay, as we mentioned, we focused more on the VMPFC. For each trial, we took the estimated relative reward of the chosen DAC and the estimated information gain from the model as the predictors, and we took the neural activity from this region as a dependent variable. So when we took a look across the full frequency range, both reward and information can significantly predict the VMPSC activity. And we especially focused on the broadband gamma activity because it has been widely considered as important for, it has been widely considered as a proxy for the local population varying. So we again found significant encoding of both variables with different peaking times. So this suggests that VMPFC did play an important role in reward and information value coding. Now we are moving to the ACC. So in contrast to the VMPFC, we found that ACC activity was selectively sensitive to the information gain, especially in the higher gamma band. So together, this functional dissociation is a key, which suggests that while VMPSC can integrate both type of value, the ACC might play a more specialized role in signaling the demand of new information. So this will potentially contribute to the motivational drive for exploration rather than representing the reward. So beyond the localized value coding, we'll next focus on how the VMPSC and ACC interact dynamically, and that's, as I mentioned, that's what we want to address. So firstly, we calculate the phase locking value, which represents the phase synchrony between these two regions, and we observed a significantly higher phase synchrony between those two regions in the equal information condition compared to the unequal condition. This suggests that when participants are primarily engaged in exploitation mode, this mode that is the time where they were having the balanced information between the three options. The VMPSC and ACC will engage in stronger synchrony. So next, to probe the direction of the information flow between those two regions, we computed the phase log index, or the PSI values, from the VMPFC to the anterior cingulate cortex. However, we can see that the directed flow was significantly stronger in the unequal condition. So collectively, this findings can reveal a most-switching connectivity pattern that indicate that during the period fearing exploitation, the VMPSC and ACC will communicate through a heightened synchrony. But when the decision context demands a strategic exploration, this interaction will shape towards a stronger, directed top-down signal from the VMPFC to the ACC. So next, we want to directly link those dynamic connectivity patterns to participants' choice. So for each game, we did a regression model that we regressed the measured PLV values onto the model-derived subjective value and information gain as what we did using the local potential. So we can see that the PLV value can significantly and positively predict the participants' reward estimation of the chosen DAC. And we can see from the permutation test result here, the beta coefficient for the reward was highly significant. So this suggests that when VMPSC and ACC are more synchronized, the brain's internal representation of the chosen option is stronger. This will guide the choice toward the higher rewards. And what is important here is the predictive relationship was specific to reward, and the PLV didn't show any significant effect on predicting the information gain. So let's take a look at the PSI values, which we said before that this is the directional signal that was significantly during the unequal condition where the participants face our exploit trade-off. So we did the regression again, and it's highly informative. We found a significant and negative prediction for reward and a positive prediction for the information. So together, these findings will provide the compelling evidence that the VMPFC to ACC flow appears to function as a top-down policy command that allows the brain to prioritize the information seeking, even at a cost of reward. So we can do a little bit a wrap-up of the current study. We found that the disposable but interacting value representation at the local circuit level, where the VMPFC robustly encode both expected reward and information gain. But in contrast, the ACC only showed a more specialized role when we're talking about the information gain. Okay. And next, those value signals are integrated through a dynamic context-dependent communication protocol between VMPFC and the ACC. This synchronized states specifically predict the choice between the higher, driven by the higher reward value. However, the directional signal was instrumental in guiding the strategic exploration. So we can make a little conclusion here. So this circuit dynamically transits from a broadly synchronized exploitation mode, which facilitates the rewards processing, to a directed exploration mode, which transcends the top-down policy command to prioritize the information seeking. So this provides a critical direct neural evidence for how our brains achieve the remarkable flexibility required for the adaptive decision-making and strategic exploration. So that's pretty much about my talk. I'll say a lot of thanks to my lab members and my supervisor and our collaborators from the Epilepsy Center of Seminole Community Hospital. So thank you, and any questions are welcome because this is still an ongoing project, so I really want to hear some comments. Okay, thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question about, is it right to understand the synchronous phase locking there as an error signal between ACC and PFC?
I'm sorry?
Is it right to understand that as an, or could it be understood as an error signal, the phase locking between the activity between ACC?
Yeah, it's more like how they're it's about the phase synchrony. They only focus on the phase between the waves on the ACC and VMPFC. We didn't, but we also did some other measures like the coherence and other measures that are used to test the. We can see the connectivity or neural couplings between those two regions, and the results are similar.
As a follow-up, I know there's some activity related to theta-gamma coupling that was representative of error detection in these regions. So I was curious if that would relate to some of the activity that you're seeing.
I think that's possible, but we didn't go in so far on the question, but we'll consider that point. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm wondering, and sorry if this is a completely off question. I'm wondering whether you have any idea what leads to shifts in the coupling between VMPFC and ACC that then triggers these, say, top-down policy things that you're describing there. So you're saying there's these two different states, and you see the difference in the coupling between the two areas, right? Do you have an idea what what drives that, or do you think that that just happens in the brain, and if that happens, then you see these changes in behavior?
I think it happens because our brain detect that the priority of the current game are different between those two conditions. In my point, I think that happened automatically, but I don't know if there are other explanations for that.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm very excited to share with you some past and ongoing work about changes in strategic exploration across development. So I think when people think about exploration, they typically think about what I'm going to refer to as external exploration, in which individuals sample actions and learn from the outcomes that those actions yield. So this could mean, selecting a movie to watch, or a subway route to take, or a dish to have at a restaurant, and then updating your beliefs. So after you explore a new option, you can update your beliefs about how good or bad it is based on your direct experience. But today, I'm going to extend this idea a little and discuss how we also learn through internal exploration, in which we sample our own thoughts. So we harness our memories or our mental models of the world to imagine actions that we could have taken and the outcomes that those actions could have yielded, and then we update our beliefs based on those imagined experiences. So I'll discuss this in more detail later, but just to give you an intuition, whenever I go to a restaurant, I typically engage in both types of exploration. So I sample one or two dishes. That's kind of my external exploration. But I can also then use my mental model of the restaurant's food to think about what would have happened had I ordered any of the other dishes. And I can update my beliefs about the value of those dishes just by thinking about them, even in the absence of direct experience. Now, this cognitive process is sometimes referred to as mental simulation, but I find it useful to consider as an internal form of exploration or information seeking. And the reason I find it useful to group this under this exploration umbrella is because external and internal information seeking really share the same central challenge, which is figuring out whether and what to explore. So we typically have many actions available to us and many possible alternatives that we could think about. So how do we choose which ones to sample? In the restaurant case, for example, we have to first determine which dish to actually order, but then there's this second decision process where after making our sort of initial external exploration decision and experiencing its outcome, we may also have to kind of selectively determine which alternatives to think about and to learn about for next time. Now, I think this is a particularly interesting question to address developmentally because exploration plays such a fundamental role in learning across the lifespan. And we know from an extensive body of work that external exploration changes dramatically from early childhood to early adulthood. By expanding our questions about the development of exploration to also include this kind of internal exploration process, we can understand how individuals actively shape their own input for learning, whether shared computations underlie kind of the increasingly strategic selection of both actions and thoughts, and ultimately how individuals may learn to leverage mental models of their environments to behave adaptively. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about two different studies that touch on these themes. The first focuses on external exploration of the environment, and I'll discuss work in which we ask what drives shifts in the explore-exploit balance across development, as well as how features of different choice options influence what people choose to explore. And then I'll turn to some ongoing work on internal exploration in adults, in which I'll examine how adults select alternative possibilities for consideration. And I'll discuss how features of different choice options influence what people choose to explore internally. I don't have developmental data for this second question yet, but I'll briefly touch on some of our developmental hypotheses for our planned future work. Okay, so the first study I'm going to talk about was conducted in collaboration with Rebecca Martin and my PhD advisor, Kate Hartley at NYU, as well as our collaborators at Caltech, Jeff Coburn and John O'Doherty. Now, I'm sure everyone here is likely familiar with the classic explore-exploit dilemma. When choosing between different options, do you explore something you have less experience with, or do you exploit a more familiar option that you know is likely to be rewarding? Now, we know from prior research that the balance between exploration and exploitation shifts across the lifespan, with children tending to explore more than adults. Greater exploration early in life promotes learning about the structure of the environment, which may be particularly advantageous when less is known about the world. But what drives exploratory decision-making across development? prior work has revealed that across age, individuals are influenced both by the perceptual novelty of choice options, as well as the uncertainty in their reward distributions. So a movie that's new to you, for example, has both high perceptual novelty and high reward uncertainty because its sensory features are new, and you're also likely unsure about how much you're going to enjoy this movie. Whereas a familiar movie has both low perceptual novelty and low reward uncertainty. Now, as this example illustrates, novelty and uncertainty are often correlated, so disentangling their effects is quite challenging. But a recent study carefully teased apart their influence in adults and found that adults were novelty-seeking but uncertainty-averse. So here we asked how the influences of novelty and uncertainty on exploration change from childhood to early adulthood. And we sought to address how changes in the effects of these choice features may contribute to decreases in exploration across development. And so to do so, we adapted a version of that reinforcement learning task that had been used in adults, which was originally developed by Jeff Coburn in John O'Doherty's lab. And in this task, on every trial, participants had to choose between 2 hiding spots to try to find a gold coin. Each hiding spot was associated with a different probability of yielding a coin. So here, for example, the participant has to choose between searching behind the flowers and searching in the tent. Now, importantly, the task was broken up into different blocks in which participants searched for coins in different territories that were sort of governed by different magical creatures. So here, I'm showing you an example of the wizard territory. And within each territory, participants saw 3 different hiding spots total across 15 trials. So here, for example, they might see the sunflowers, the acorns, and the tent. Now, in each territory, participants encountered 2 familiar hiding spots that they had seen before, and 1 novel hiding spot that had never been presented. Now, importantly, they were told that different creatures had different preferences for hiding spots. So that meant that the reward probabilities associated with each hiding spot were reset at the beginning of the block. And in this way, all stimuli had high reward uncertainty at the start of the block, but their level of perceptual novelty differed. Now, you can think about this as akin to being selecting a movie for a new acquaintance to watch. The movies are going to vary in their level of familiarity to you, but because you don't know your acquaintance very well, you'll have high uncertainty about how much they'll enjoy any of them. Okay, so we had 122 participants evenly distributed between the ages of 8 and 27 complete the experiment. We examined how expected value uncertainty and novelty influence participants' choices on every trial. So for each option, we defined expected value as the mean of the experienced rewards within the territory. We defined uncertainty as the variance of the rewards experienced within that territory. And we defined novelty such that it was inversely related to the number of times the participant had encountered each choice option throughout the entire experiment. We then examined how these 3 variables influenced participants' choices across age. So on this plot, the x-axis represents the value difference between the 2 choice options presented on each trial, and the y-axis represents the proportion of trials in which participants chose a particular option. So the first thing I'm going to plot is just participants' choices as a function of the value difference between the left and right option. What you can see is that participants across age were more likely to choose the higher value option, and this relation strengthened across development. So it's a bit hard to see here, but those yellow lines get sort of steeper and more step-like with increasing age. Now, this finding is in line with many prior studies, suggesting that adults make more exploitative, value-driven choices relative to younger children. And so here, too, we find that children are more exploratory. But what we really want to know is what is driving that exploration? So to address this, I'm going to plot the proportion of trials in which participants chose the more versus the less novel option in blue, and the more versus the less uncertain option in red, still as a function of the expected value difference between the 2 options. So if participants were not influenced by novelty or uncertainty, we'd expect the blue and red lines to be perfectly overlaid on the yellow lines. If participants show novelty or uncertainty-seeking behavior, we'd expect the curves to be shifted to the left, indicating that a smaller value difference is required to elicit similar choice behavior. If participants show novelty or uncertainty-averse behavior, we'd expect the curves to be shifted to the right, indicating that a greater expected value difference is required to counteract the effects of novelty or uncertainty on choice. So here, we see that for novelty, the curve has shifted to the left slightly, indicating that participants made novelty-seeking choices. And this effect of novelty was consistent across age. But for uncertainty, we see a different pattern. So here the curves are shifted to the right, indicating uncertainty aversion. So unlike the effects of novelty, which was consistent across age, the effects of uncertainty increased from childhood to adulthood. And you can see that a little bit more clearly in this plot. So to get a better grasp of these effects, we can also examine just the trials in which the two choice options had very, very similar expected values. And so here we can clearly see that when choosing between two similarly valued options, participants across age preferred the novel one. And with increasing age, they demonstrated increasing uncertainty aversion. Now, these regression analyses compute the true value, novelty, and uncertainty of each choice option without taking into account how participants actually track these values over the course of learning. So we also characterized our data with different reinforcement learning models, which account for learning by amplifying the influence of more recent wins and losses. So specifically in our model, we computed a recency-weighted sum of experienced wins and losses, where the weighting of recent outcomes is determined by participant-specific learning rates. And from these recency-weighted sums, we can then derive the expected value of each choice option, again by taking the means of those distributions. We also augmented the models with different parameters that instantiated novelty, uncertainty, or interactive biases in how participants valued each option. So the model accounts for participants' novelty bias by changing how the numbers of experienced wins and losses are initialized. In this way, novel options can be initialized optimistically, leading to novelty-seeking behavior. When determining the utility of each choice option, we assume that participants consider its expected value as well as its uncertainty. So again, we take those recency-weighted distributions of wins and losses, or the recency-weighted sums of wins and losses, we combine them into a beta distribution, and then the uncertainty is computed as the variance in that distribution. In the model, uncertainty is then multiplied by a participant-specific weighting parameter. When this parameter takes on a negative value, the utility of more uncertain options is reduced, leading to uncertainty aversion. Finally, the model can also account for interactive effects of novelty and uncertainty by weighting the uncertainty term by stimulus familiarity. And this is going to amplify the influence of uncertainty on more familiar stimuli. So we found that adolescents and adults were best captured by this model that included this familiarity-gated uncertainty weighting, meaning they showed interactive effects of novelty and uncertainty. Children, however, were best fit by a simpler model, where the value of novel options was initialized optimistically. Now, importantly, our modeling results revealed that the algorithm that best captured children's choices did not take into account uncertainty at all. Why don't children use uncertainty to guide choice? Is it because they don't track uncertainty at all, or are they simply not averse to it? To address this question, we examined how uncertainty influenced participants' response times. Now, if children don't track uncertainty at all, we would expect there to be no influence of uncertainty on how long it took them to make a decision. But we found that across age, participants were slower to select more uncertain options. And so this provides some evidence that children were in fact sensitive to option uncertainty, but just not as averse to it as the adults were. Okay, so taken together, we found that distinct features of choice options differentially drive exploration across development. Novelty seems to motivate information seeking similarly across age, but uncertainty aversion increased across development. Now, I do want to note that these very specific trajectories are likely task dependent. Adults typically modulate their uncertainty seeking in response to the structure of the environment. In this case, for example, participants only made 15 choices within each creature's territory, and so they had little opportunity to resolve uncertainty and exploit that new knowledge. And so that's why we may have seen uncertainty aversion in adults in this task. Adults here may have been demonstrating strategic exploration, which is in line with findings from many other studies. Now, while children's behavior was less value-driven than adults, it was still systematic. So children were not just randomly acting in the world, they just seemed to be using different strategies to explore their environments. And these findings highlight how the statistics of the world that people experience change across development. Learners are playing an active, age-varying role in shaping the statistics of their environments through exploration, which in turn influences what they learn and how they behave in the future. Now, returning back to the idea that I previewed at the beginning of the talk, we know that people learn through both external and internal exploration. So we also want to understand the extent to which our results generalize to the internal context. So does internal exploration also change systematically across development? Do different features of choice options differentially drive exploratory decisions from childhood to adulthood in this internal domain? And so that's the question we're ultimately hoping to address in this next line of work. Again, I don't yet have developmental data to address this, but I'm going to share with you some ongoing work in adults that highlights what we believe is a promising approach to ultimately characterize these developmental changes. And this work was done in collaboration with my postdoc advisor, Nathaniel Daw. So again, we learn from direct experience by taking actions, experiencing their outcomes, and updating our beliefs about the values of those actions. But we also learn from imagined experience by leveraging mental models to simulate the consequences of the actions that we could have taken. And this has been demonstrated in many studies of counterfactual learning. But in most studies of counterfactual learning, participants only need to consider one alternative action. In the real world, though, in most situations, in the same way that there's many alternatives that we can select for external exploration, there's many, many alternatives that we could consider. And we typically can't think about everything. We don't have the time, we don't necessarily have the computational resources to consider and update every alternative. So we're faced with this problem of needing to select only a subset of possibilities to consider. So how do we solve this? Now, past work across different domains has hinted that people may rationally prioritize simulation of possibilities that will best facilitate adaptive future behavior. And so our goal in the present work is to build on these findings to more precisely characterize how people leverage mental models to select possibilities to think about. We're ultimately interested in characterizing kind of individual differences in rational external exploration, as well as how those differences emerge. So our first step was to develop a fun behavioral task that's going to allow us to measure variation in this model-based learning process. And what we came up with is this battle cards task. I'm gonna just play the video. Hold on, is the video playing? Yes, okay. This battle cards task can be thought of as a mashup of Pokemon and rock, paper, scissors. So in the game, on every trial, participants have to select one of those 5 cards to play against their computerized opponent. Their computerized opponent is also going to select a card to play, and a deterministic payoff matrix determine which card wins the battle. So each card will defeat 2 other cards, tie itself, and lose against 2 other cards. And we designed this to be as intuitive as possible. So for example, water will defeat fire and rock, but will lose against ice because ice freezes water. Okay, so participants first learned this payoff matrix through a series of instructions and tutorials. And then they played this game against 8 different computerized opponents. Now, each real game involved 20 trials, and participants were told that each opponent had different preferred cards. So one opponent, for example, might prefer rock cards and fire cards, and another opponent might prefer ice cards. So what this meant is that participants could learn through trial and error which cards tended to be good against each opponent. And importantly, participants were told that each of their opponents had built their entire decks ahead of time before starting to play, which meant that their card selections were predetermined and not responsive to participants' own selections. So participants have to try to learn their opponent's preferences, but they don't have to worry about what we might worry about when we're playing rock, paper, scissors, which is like trying to trick the opponent or something like that. Okay, so to figure out which cards would be good against each opponent, participants could learn through experience by observing the outcomes of their choices and updating their value estimates for the card they played. So here, for example, if the participant plays ice and loses, they can decrease their value estimate for playing ice against this opponent. Critically, however, because participants learned the full model of the task, they could also imagine how many points they would have won or lost had they played each of the other 4 cards. And they can update their beliefs about how good or bad those unplayed cards are as well. So here, for example, again, if the opponent, if you play ice and you lose against fire, you could also imagine what would have happened had you played rock, had you played water, had you played fire, or had you played grass. Okay, so what we found is that participants were able to learn to select good cards against their opponents, performing above chance level. And we also saw that participants did in fact rely on this counterfactual learning. So on the second trial of each game, when participants have very little, only 1 trial's worth of experience with each opponent, they were more likely to select cards that would have earned 1 or 2 points on the previous trial. So this indicates that participants are leveraging a mental model of the task to select cards with which they have no direct experience. Okay, what we really want to know though is how are participants learning? What are they learning about on each trial? Are they updating their beliefs about all 4 alternatives equally? Or are they systematically prioritizing, thinking about some of the alternatives more than others? One important feature of this task is that the alternative outcomes differ along 2 dimensions. So first, they differ in valence, meaning they can be either better or worse than the experienced outcome. And they also differ in magnitude, meaning they can result in a gain or loss of 0, 1, or 2 points. And so to characterize how people were learning, we fit variants of a model with both factual and counterfactual learning components, where the learning rates vary along these 2 valence and magnitude dimensions. Now, I want to first point out that our 2 worst fitting models were the model that had full counterfactual learning and no counterfactual learning. And so this indicates that in accordance with our model agnostic results, people are learning counterfactually in this task, but they're not fully updating their beliefs about all alternatives on every trial. So that means what they're doing is that they're selectively exploring some of these 4 alternatives, but not all of them. Okay. But are they doing so systematically, or are they just kind of doing so randomly? Well, they are doing so systematically. So our next worst fitting model was the model that implemented random selection of counterfactual alternatives for consideration. So this model also fit quite poorly, which means that participants were exploring the space of possibilities systematically. We found that our data was best characterized by a model with 4 counterfactual learning rates, indicating that people prioritize different updates based on both valence and magnitude. So first, replicating past work, we found a main effect of valence, indicating that participants engaged in upward counterfactual learning, meaning they more strongly updated their beliefs about alternatives that would have been better than the option they selected. So if a participant played ice and lost 1 point, they're potentially thinking like, oh man, I should have played rock or water. They're not really thinking like, oh, well, at least I didn't play grass. Extending prior work, we found that this valence effect varied depending on outcome magnitude. So specifically, participants most strongly updated their belief about the best alternative. Now, this pattern of updating may be rational because if participants are capacity limited and they can't think about everything, it may make sense to prioritize learning about the single action that they should take on the next trial. Prioritizing learning about that action may drive the biggest improvement in their decision policy. So we next asked how participants are actually learning about the option they did select. We initially thought participants might update their beliefs about the cards they played more when they selected a bad option, because selecting a bad option would also indicate the need to change their decision policy. But that's not actually what we found. So instead, we found that here too, participants prioritized learning about the best option. So factual learning rates were higher on trials when participants played the best possible card and won 2 points. So we still have more work to do to determine the extent to which participants' prioritization of value updates aligns with the prediction of rational models. But overall, we extended past findings on upward counterfactual learning to demonstrate that people prioritize learning about the best option, whether they did or did not select it. Now, prioritizing sort of the exploration of and learning about the best alternative may be a rational strategy, particularly in situations like our game, where all options are available on every trial. One way I'd like to extend this work in the future is to manipulate the statistics of the task so that not all options are available on every trial. We can vary the frequency with which options are available to see if participants rationally learn more about options that they'll have more opportunity to choose. More broadly, now that we have a task that enables us to measure how people selectively learn about alternatives, I'm also excited to address questions about developmental differences in rational prioritization of the internal information that people choose to sample. I'm very interested in understanding the extent to which we can consider external and internal information seeking as depending on shared mechanisms that follow similar developmental trajectories. Again, in both cases, people are dealing with this same selection or prioritization problem. There's many actions and thoughts available, and the features that cause some to be selected over others may change systematically with age. Now, across the 2 studies that I shared today, we looked at different features for external and internal exploration, but I'm excited about future work using a more unified feature space, and I'd be happy to discuss this more in the Q&A. So I think there's a lot of open questions here that I'm really at the very beginning of exploring, but I'm excited to continue working on this in my new lab. So with that, I'd just like to thank my funding sources, my collaborators, research assistants, and all of you for listening. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kate. Do we have any questions?
Hi, thank you for excellent talk. So I have a question for your research study one. So I remember there is a slide that you give a definition about value, uncertainty, and novelty.
Yeah.
Especially about uncertainty, it's about the variances of reward, while novelty is about the times of exposure to that reward, right? To that option, or maybe
Yeah,
the
that
times of
option. Yep,
feedback,
that option.
kind of anti-correlated, right?
Sorry, what was the question?
Oh, so I remember you have a definition about novelty and uncertainty.
Yeah.
So uncertainty means the variances of rewards, while the novelty, you define it as times of exposure to that option's reward or feedbacks, right?
So it's the novelty we're defining as being kind of inversely related to the number of times that you've seen that choice option appear as an option throughout the entire task.
Oh, the options entirely.
Yeah. So because here we're sort of defining novelty as really being about the perceptual novelty of the stimulus. And so we're defining it as being basically inversely related to how many times you've seen that stimulus just appear over the course of the task.
So sometimes the options are not visible.
No, sorry, they're always visible, but I guess expected value and uncertainty we're defining as being directly related to choosing the option and experiencing the reward. So, whereas novelty, you don't actually have to choose it for its novelty to be affected.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Thank you for
So
clarifying.
it's a good question, because one of the reasons we think that children may be using novelty but not uncertainty is because it's a much simpler computation, because again, you only have to track how many times you've seen the stimulus, which might rely on kind of simple recognition memory mechanisms, whereas the other features, value and uncertainty, you actually have to track not just seeing the option, but the association between the option and its reward outcomes, and so that might be a slightly more complex computation.
Yeah, thank you.
So I find the idea of internal exploration very interesting. And I'm thinking that older people have had more experiences, and so they might have more to explore. Is it possible that the earlier results that show that children do more exploration and adults more exploitation could be reinterpreted to be that children do more external exploration and adults do more internal exploration?
Yeah, that's a great question and something I'm really interested in thinking about in the future. I think we don't have the data to necessarily know whether that's the case. I think my postdoc advisor, Nathaniel, has a really nice theoretical paper which also suggests that kind of the balance between external and internal exploration might be driven by kind of affective states of fatigue and boredom. So boredom might be an affective state that sort of encourages you to explore your external environment, whereas fatigue might be an internal state that basically encourages you to stop exploring and just think about the information that you already have. And so one of the reasons why I think this is an interesting developmental hypothesis is because I think most of our intuitions would be that older people tend to, not even older people, but younger, just adults relative to children tend to demonstrate more fatigue, and younger children tend to demonstrate more boredom. And so it's possible that these observations indicate exactly what you're saying, that there is this systematic shift between the amount of time that we kind of spend exploring internally versus exploring externally, and it might actually be the balance between how we spend that time might be sort of very rationally determined based on the amount of experience that we have.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm wondering, for the internal exploration part at the end, I'm wondering if we're thinking of this like an exploration process or kind of internally sampling from experiences, then do you think if you manipulated the time people had in between trials, they would have more time to sample more?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we're kind of hypothesizing that people are limited and they can only explore, they can't explore all of the alternatives. But I think we don't yet have a great sense of why that is. So one idea might be that it really is about time, and if we gave people sort of unlimited time to sit there, exactly, that they would just sit there and sort of think about all the 4 alternatives. But I think there's other limitations as well. So there also could be kind of like working memory limitations, for example. And these types of limitations may differentially influence children and adults as well, yeah.
Or you might also find if you gave them a short amount of time, then instead of waiting all 4 of those, you might see it like constrict, like they only prioritize
Yeah,
one
and
or something. You might be able to read out like if they're doing an reliable.
Yeah, so I think I didn't get into this, but our current learning rate estimates sort of seem to suggest that people are thinking about one option on every trial. It would be interesting if you give them more time, are they thinking about more? And then, you know, there's some really interesting work on like replay, which this is very related to, that also suggests that you might kind of shift the balance depending on when you impose the time limitations, like if you're imposing it sort of after choice, before choice. But yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's something we'd be interested in exploring in the future.
Pete, if you're okay with it, we'll take one more question while Tasha gets set up.
Hi, thank you very much. Very intriguing. I found it interesting to see the differences in exploration and also uncertainty aversion across age groups. Maybe a bit of a speculative question. What do you think are reasons for this? Do you think there are particular experiences which drive these changes across age? And do you think there are maybe critical periods?
Yeah, I'm not. So I think, you know, there's multiple explanations. One is this idea that the computation for novelty is simpler than the computation of uncertainty. But I also think it's really interesting to consider the extent to which it's sort of adaptive or maladaptive. You know, I talked a little bit about the uncertainty aversion in adults being modulated by like the horizon over which people have to explore. So if you have more time to explore, you know, Bob in many studies has shown that if you have more time to explore, you're going to be more uncertainty seeking. You know, it's been speculated that children just in general have like a longer horizon in terms of like the amount of time in their lives they have left to explore. And so maybe they are, maybe this is just a generally adaptive strategy to be less averse to uncertainty. But I don't think we necessarily have super good empirical evidence that that is in fact what's going on. But so I'd be interested in kind of thinking about that, you know, maybe with some of the sort of like large-scale evolutionary or developmental meta-learning hypotheses that Ethan was talking about. Thanks.
Let's thank Kate for the great talk. And last but very much not least, we have Tasha Fan.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the organizers again for this amazing conference. I've been enjoying it a lot, and today I would love to talk to you guys about some of my work on exploration. So since we're all here, I will assume that we are all going to agree on this following couple of statements. First, we human beings make decisions, ranging from what to eat for dinner and what to do for your life. And most of these decisions, or should I say almost all of them, are being made on uncertainty. Regardless of its origin, uncertainty makes it hard to identify the best course of the action. And at the face of uncertainty, what do? We gather information. We Google around, we ask people, we reduce uncertainty, and hopefully we make better decisions in the long run. But the question that I guess a lot of us here are interested and are actively working on is how are people able to achieve that? So my work focused on exploration as one instance of information gathering behavior. Exploration during decision making is usually contrast with exploitation. The latter means choosing the current best option. Exploration therefore means choosing foregoing the current best option and try something else that could potentially be better. Choosing between restaurants is already a classic example of exploit, and of course I'm still using it. I guess the only thing changes for me is the specific context I'm putting it in here, and for people who are from like local region, they may realize this is the Thayer Street outside of Brown University, and this will be my example for most of my talk today. So for me, if I go to my favorite spot on Thayer Street, East Side Pocket, it is an act of exploitation. While going to Cafe Nero that newly opened will be exploration. As we can see from this example, exploration sacrifices the immediate reward, which will be the falafel wrap, in exchange for information, the goodness of the food at the Cafe Nero, and it's crucial for maximizing long-term reward. So how do people explore? In previous talk and the talks earlier today, especially case talk, we already talked a little bit about that, but just let me do my due diligence and just strike it again. So previous work have documented several exploration strategies that people deploy. Early research has identified the value-driven exploration, which basically means people choose the option in proportion to their relative value. So since the east side pocket is my most valuable option in this whole choice set, this strategy will predict that I choose east side pocket more frequently and explore Cafe Nero from time to time. More recent work has also suggested that people can use uncertainty-driven exploration. In other words, people can use uncertainty environment to guide exploration, which has two distinct flavors. Direct exploration suggests that people will show a bias for information and direct exploration towards a relative uncertain option. If I have less experience with Cafe Nero, trying it out this time will be seen as direct exploration. It is worth emphasizing that the direct exploration is sensitive to relative uncertainty, that is, how uncertain an option is in comparison to other options in the choice set. Total uncertainty, on the other hand, can influence people's exploration as well. Random exploration suggests that when total uncertainty is high, people behave more randomly than when total uncertainty is low. An example of a high total uncertainty will be the first month of starting my postdoc here, during which I may have more switch back and forth between different options. As for now, I explore less, since I'm pretty sure which option is better. And previous work has shown that people use a mixture of these three strategies, and maybe more importantly and interestingly, there are substantial individual differences in how people use these strategies. So where do these individual differences come from? Here, I propose that characterizing the interaction between affective components and exploration could be useful to understand these individual differences. So when facing uncertainty, people report various affective experiences, both subjectively and physiologically. These situational affective responses could interact with trait-level factors related to psychopathology, such as trait anxiety, to influence the way people perceive and interact with the world. So now I'm going to present two projects looking at how anxiety as well as physiological arousal influence exploration. So let's start with anxiety. The relationship between anxiety and exploration has long been of interest to researchers, which has been discussed earlier today by multiple speakers. From a clinical perspective, avoidant behavior, which is commonly observed in anxiety population, has long been linked to decreased exploration. For example, a socially anxious individual may avoid going to parties because they want to exploit their current best option, which is to stay at home. In fact, this anti-correlation between anxiety and exploration has been so long assumed that the reduced spatial exploration in a maze setting has been considered as a behavioral signature of anxiety in rodent model. However, empirical finding on the impact of anxiety on exploration during decision-making, which is the type of exploration that I'm discussing here, is more mixed. There are work showing that anxious individuals explore more, explore less, or do not find a relationship. Why is this the case? So we reason that this may be because the past work overlooked the multidimensionality of exploration as well as anxiety. As we talked about before, exploration can be decomposed into multiple distinct strategies, and so is anxiety. Specifically, I'm here focusing on somatic and cognitive dimensions of anxiety, which has been seen as two major transdiagnostic factors that cut across DSM-defined anxiety disorders. Somatic anxiety refers to the physical experience of anxiety, such as trembling and feeling a butterfly in the stomach, while cognitive anxiety refers to symptoms more related to thought processes, such as rumination and worry. These two factors has been shown to have distinct impacts on learning under uncertainty, which made us curious whether they're going to exert differential impacts on exploration. So to dissociate different exploration strategies, we use a two-arm bandit task. I will explain the label part a bit later. Also note that I may use slot machine and bandit arm kind of like interchangeably through the talk. So on each trial, participants encounter a pair of slot machine and choose between them. Upon choice, they receive feedback, that is how many coins they have collected by choosing the slot machine immediately. This process gets repeated 10 times within a block, and then they start a new block with a new pair of slot machine. Before any choices, they're informed of the type of slot machine, and the labels can be seen throughout the experiment. In this game, we had two types of slot machines, stable and fluctuating. Both slot machines deliver coins around a generated mean value, the difference being that the stable slot machine generate outcome around the fixed mean value, while the fluctuating slot machine generate outcome around the drifting mean value. So here I'm showing the trajectory of the mean value in a range of 10 trials in a mock block. So as you can see, the fluctuating slot machine, the purple line here, could have sometimes possess a higher generated mean, sometimes a lower generated mean than the stable slot machine. The intuition here is that the fluctuating slot machine is perceived to be more uncertain than a stable slot machine. To make it more concrete, on the right, I'm showing a mock participant interacting with one stable slot machine and one fluctuating slot machine for 10 trials. This time, I'm showing the coins received instead of the generated mean value. So there's some noise on top of the generated mean. As you can see, across the 10 trials, although the average reward received from those two slot machines are kind of comparable, the decision maker will have more uncertainty in the number of coins being generated by the fluctuating slot machine if there's a next trial. As we have mentioned before, the slot machine will be resampled at the beginning of each block. Specifically, we have 4 conditions annotated by the slot machine type on the left and the one on the right. So for example, SF means participants are going to interact with one stable slot machine and one fluctuating slot machine, with the stable slot machine being shown on the left-hand side of the screen. These experiment conditions are designed to independently manipulate relative and total uncertainty. So based on the premise that the fluctuating slot machine is more uncertain than the stable slot machine, we argue that the relative uncertainty of the slot machine on the left in the SF condition is smaller than the one in the FS condition, which are the red ones being squared out here. Additionally, since participants in both conditions are interacting with one stable and one fluctuating slot machine, we assume that the total uncertainty in these two conditions are roughly the same. Similarly, we argue that the total uncertainty of the FF condition is higher than the SS condition, which is analogous to the first months of the postdoc and how many years after that. Because participants are interacting with two slot machines of the same type, we assume that the relative uncertainty in the SS and FF condition are roughly the same. Given this design, we're able to show behavioral signature of these 3 exploration strategies we have mentioned before. So as for direct exploration, it predicts that people will direct exploration towards a relative uncertain option environment. Since the fluctuating slot machine is more uncertain than the stable slot machine, direct exploration will predict that people prefer the fluctuating slot machine when choosing between one stable and one fluctuating arm. So the prediction goes, if we plot people's choice behavior in SF and FS condition as psychometric curves, with a value difference on the x-axis and the probability of choosing the option on the left on the y-axis, we should expect to see there is an intercept difference between SF and FS condition. That is, people will prefer the left option in the FS condition and the right option in the SF condition, controlling for the value. Indeed, our data suggests that people will have a larger intercept in FS condition compared to SF condition. In contrast, random exploration suggests that people behave more randomly when the total uncertainty is high. Since we assume total uncertainty in FF is higher than SS, random exploration predicts that people will have more choice stochasticity in FF conditions than SS condition. So similar to the previous analysis, if we plot the psychometric curve for these two conditions, the random exploration will predict a flatter curve for FF condition than the SS condition. That is, given the same relative value on the x-axis, people in the FF condition choose the left option with a probability that is closer to 50% at chance. Indeed, this is what our data suggests, that the slope for the psychometric curve in the SS condition is larger than the FF condition. So together, these results suggest that the independent manipulation of the relative and total uncertainty could causally impact directed and random exploration. Finally, just for the completeness, for value-driven exploration, this algorithm predicts that people choose the option with higher relative value more frequently and explore the option with lower relative value from time to time. This result is already embedded in the previous analysis, since the slope of all those 4 psychometric curves are all positive. In other words, as the relative value of the left option goes up, people are more likely to choose the left option in a sigmoid fashion instead of a steps function fashion. So together, we have found behavioral signature of these 3 distinct exploration strategies. So another way to, oh, this one I'm saying, cool. So another way to, oops, is this, okay. Cool. Another way to analyze pupils' behavior across conditions is to extract estimates of the variable of interest and estimate how variation in these variables influence their choice on a trial-by-trial basis. Specifically, if we take another look at these three exploration strategies descriptions, we notice that there are three value and uncertainty estimation terms that these strategies are sensitive to, including relative uncertainty, total uncertainty, and the relative value. So we'll focus on these three estimates in the following analysis. To derive the estimate of these three variables, we model people's belief update process as an ideal Bayesian observer, which is a hypothesis that a lot of previous work in RL has adopted. So given the Gaussian distributional structure underlying our task, we assume that people maintain a Gaussian distribution for their estimate of the number of coins generated for both slot machine with mean Q and standard deviation sigma. On each trial, given the newly observed outcome, participants update their estimation distribution in a way that the posterior mean will be closer to the outcome and the posterior standard deviation, that is, the uncertainty in posterior estimation is reduced due to the observation of new information. To match our intuition that the fluctuating slot machine is more uncertain than the stable slot machine, we assume that the update for the fluctuating slot machine is slower than the stable slot machine. So to be more specific, given the same prior distribution and reward, which is illustrated as a black curve here, the posterior distribution for the fluctuating slot machine, illustrated here as a light blue curve, has larger standard deviation sigma t+1 when compared to the stable slot machine, which is the blue curve here. The posterior mean qt+1 for fluctuating slot machine is also closer to the prior mean compared to the posterior mean for the stable slot machine. Based on this model, we operationalize relative value as a posterior mean of the left option relative to the right option, relative uncertainty as a posterior standard deviation of the left option to the right option, and total uncertainty as a pooled variance across two options. We then use a probability regression, which is similar to a logistic regression, to examine the influence of these three terms on people's choice across four conditions. Previous work has shown that these coefficients can be interpreted as a weight of directed, random, and value-driven exploration strategies, respectively. So we collected 501 participants' data from Prolific and run the regression. The results, as we expected, suggest that all coefficients are significantly positive, indicating that people use a hybrid of directed, random, and value-driven exploration. So based upon this regression model, we now add different kinds of anxiety and their interactions with exploration strategies to investigate how anxiety modulates the exploration processes. As we mentioned before, we focus on somatic and cognitive dimensions of anxiety as two latent factors of trait anxiety. Our data suggests a negative interaction between somatic anxiety and direct exploration, indicating that people scoring high on somatic anxiety showed reduced direct exploration and manifest as avoiding the option with high relative uncertainty. And we do not find a relationship between cognitive anxiety and direct exploration, nor between any trait anxiety factor and random exploration. So I'm very excited at this set of results because first, it could potentially explain the avoidance behavior that is observed in anxiety disorder, because anxious individuals do not explore the relatively uncertain options, such as going out with friends, which could be viewed as avoiding the uncertain option. Second, the differential effect of somatic and cognitive anxiety on exploration could potentially explain the inconsistency in existing research, since different anxiety measurements may tap into somatic and cognitive anxiety aspect differently. So the previous study has reviewed the selective link between somatic anxiety and direct exploration. That's great. Trait anxiety is presumed to be stationary over time. So what about transitory moment-to-moment arousal signal, which is a common affective response to uncertainty? Does it also play a role in influence exploration? This is what I set up to examine in the next study. So previous work has already identified a key role of physiological arousal in learning on uncertainty. Specifically, pupil-linked arousal system, the arousal system that mediates pupil size, has been found to covary with uncertain estimate in environment, as well as signaling upcoming decisions, such as a cat. Therefore, pupil-linked arousal system is well positioned to represent uncertainty and regulate uncertainty-driven exploration. Another motivation to investigate pupil is due to its close link with locus coeruleus neural preference system, which is one major source of pupil-linked arousal system, and is closely linked to the explore-exploit dilemma in previous research. To simply put, theory posits that the tonic neural preference associated with an increase in neural response to both task and no task-related stimulus, which promotes exploration. Similar to the critiques we have brought up before, previous literature did not systematically examine the role of pupil-linked arousal system in different sparring strategies, and this is what we're going to do to fill in the blanks. So we use a similar task as a previous study with two changes. First, we manipulate uncertainty in a different way, this time by having a safe and risky slot machine, which differ in their riskiness. Happy to talk more about this, but due to time limits, let's just take it as a face value. That is, the risky option have more uncertainty than the safe option, just as the fluctuating option has more uncertainty than the stable option in the previous study. Second, since we're interested in participants' real-time pupil size, we record the pupillometry through our experiment using an eye tracker, and the test timing has been prolonged accordingly to have reliable pupil measurement, with each trial taking about 10 seconds. Although we record their pupils throughout the experiment, we're especially interested in their pupil response in the trial baseline period, that is average pupil size in the 1,000 milliseconds before the evaluation phase, given existing theory on the link between tonic neural preference and exploration. I also want to point out that due to our block design, that is, participants are aware that they're going to interact with the same pair of slot machine for 10 trials within the block, the trial baseline pupil size contain task-related information rather than mere random fluctuation. So we collected 48 participants' data in the lab, and first, behaviorally, we used the same probability regression model as previous study to examine on a trial-by-trial basis the exploration strategies people use. We replicate previous results, finding that people use a hybrid of value-driven, directed exploration, and random exploration, with all coefficients larger than 0. We then examine whether people's pupil size during trial baseline covariate is uncertain and value estimates. The model largely stayed the same as the one I have shown you before for the behavioral data, with one extra regressor here, that is a total uncertainty, since we do not necessarily assume an inverse ratio between total uncertainty and pupil size. Our results suggest a positive association between trial baseline pupil size and total uncertainty. That is, the pupil size during the trial baseline is larger on trials where total uncertainty is high. To make it more concrete, if we bin out the trials based on the total uncertainty level into low, middle, and high 3 levels, the high total uncertainty trials, which are the red lines here, as we can see, the pupil size is larger. And this difference in pupil size starts to emerge during trial baseline, which is the shadow area here, and continues throughout the trial without crossover. Due to the time limit, I will not go into more details about this study, but we also did a decode analysis, which basically suggests that pupil not only covary with the uncertain estimates, but also play a role in encodes the total uncertainty, as well as guiding people's random exploration later on. So together, these two studies have shown both how trait level and situation level factor interact with exploration, which provide a perspective of understanding individual differences during information gathering behavior. So in the remaining time, sorry for rushing a bit, because I want to tell you another study that we have worked on looking at a similar yet distinct topic. So far, I have been focusing on exploration during decision-making, which involve taking explicit actions, interacting with the environment, and receiving feedback. However, exploration can also be directed internally, where we think about different options, as Kit was just presenting before, mentally evaluate them during planning. So planning is a process during which we interact with the world model with the goal of finding a high-value sequence of action to carry out later on. It is ubiquitous in our everyday life, ranging from something high-stakes such as choosing a career to something small, such as planning a day trip. So as a toy example, let's say you are now planning a trip for your post-conference day here in Providence. You can plan to go to a coffee shop and work and call it a day. Or you can plan to take a bus to Newport and then either get some good food or go to the beach. Under this context, exploitation means to stick to the current best plan, and exploration refers to seeking out new plans. Given the uncertainty-driven exploration framework, we examine whether people use uncertainty to guide planning as well. We specifically focus on direct exploration, that is a type of exploration sensitive to relative uncertainty. This heuristic has been used in reinforcement learning algorithm, has been proved to help efficient planning. A methodologically challenge that we face when studying planning is that it is covert and is not easily observable. To examine the dynamic during planning, we design a route planning task which separates and externalize the planning process, which I call it trick-or-treat game. So participants are presented with a map, and their goal is to move their pumpkin avatar along the arrows and collect as many rewards/treats as possible. In this toy example, there are 4 possible routes, and they will have to pick one action sequence. We provide participants with information to help them select a good action sequence. Specifically, there is a 30-second planning phase, or I call it ghost mode. This is how we call, during which participants can move their avatar on the map to review the reward at different locations. In this example, the ghost pumpkin take a left-up action sequence and reveal that this route can give them 4 points in total. The participant can then start again from the starting point, explore a different route with the reward information from previous tries stay on the screen throughout the planning phase. They know that the reward information in the planning phase does not influence their payoff at the end, and when they are ready, they can decide to end the planning phase and execute the action sequences. The separation between these 2 phases and the fact that participants need to move the avatar to review the reward encourage them to make use of this phase so that we can get information about what is going on. In other words, what options are they considering during this planning phase. It may seem manageable to exhaustively visit all the nodes from this toy example, but the task structure we use is more complicated, and participants can just simply do not have time to exhaustively visit all the nodes. So under this limited resource and limited uncertain option situation, they have to make a decision of which part of the map that they prefer to review during the planning phase. So we manipulate relative uncertainty by changing the number of future nodes that link to one node. Intuition here is that all else being equal, there's greater epistemic uncertainty in the value of nodes with more children because those nodes lead to a larger number of possible future rewards. The uncertainty about which of the reward will actually be obtained will contribute to high uncertainty in the node's value. So getting back to the day trip example here, there is more uncertainty in the value of the bus stop node during planning since you are not sure if you're going down the food route or the beach route. And to abstract a little bit, I'm now showing an example of tree structure. In this case, the node inside the right circles and the gray circles have more children nodes than their siblings, and this is exactly one possible structure we use in the experiment. Given the prediction from direct exploration that people would prefer to explore the option with high relative uncertainty, we predict that during planning, people would prefer visit nodes with more future states compared to their siblings. In other words, we predict that if people are at this green node where the pumpkin is at, they're more likely to go down the path on the left, while if they are at the yellow node, they're more likely to go down the path on the right. So as what we have done in the previous analysis, we analyzed the data by plotting their value difference between 2 options on the x-axis and the probability of choosing the left option on the y-axis. And what we can see is that if we group people's choice based on whether there is more future states on the left versus on the right, which corresponding to the green and yellow line here, we can see a intercept difference between these 2 psychometric curves. So in other words, given the same value difference between 2 options, we see that people prefer to visit the nodes with more children nodes. We can also distinguish this uncertainty using a more subtle measurement as a number of indirect decedents. So for the green node here, it will be the number of nodes in later levels skipping the immediate next level. Again, we see that people prefer to visit the nodes with more indirect decedents. So together, these studies have shown that people are sensitive to uncertainty and can use it to guide their exploration both internally and externally to make that decisions. I'm very excited at this line of work, and as Kate mentioned before, this interaction between internal and external exploration is definitely something I would love to explore more in the future. But in the meantime, thank you for your attention and happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much. Do we have any questions for Hasha?
Hi, great talk. I was wondering if you're thinking in any future project, I mean, I thought about this in the anxiety results because that's what I knew about your work already, but maybe it could apply to the rest. And also to Kate's talk, like, have you thought of incorporating novelty? Like,
sorry, what novelty?
Yeah, to sort of quantify or incorporate like novelty-driven exploration as one of the additional drivers.
Yeah, definitely. I think the reason that we didn't include it in the first place was because it feels as part of the epistemic uncertainty that you can reduce by just merely exposing it for multiple times. And from this framework, I would expected to have a similar prediction as what our results currently are showing. Basically, if you kind of, as exposed it more, then you kind of just are less likely to choose it since it's of lower uncertainty in total. But I do agree that there seems to be something more than that for the novelty aspects, especially for perceptually speaking, as well as people have this like different dimensions of curiosity about they're curious about perceptual or the information about it. So I definitely think it's something interesting to look into. Probably I'll need to paradigm with just beyond 2 boring buttons on the screen, because I would kind of doubt what is an uncertain or novelty in there. But I definitely think it plays a role, but may not be that much in the current study.
Cool, thank you.
Really great talk, thank you. I was wondering, with the first study with anxiety, if you've also modeled the task with asymmetric positive and negative learning rates. I guess I'm wondering whether the uncertainty aversion is really also just a signature of pessimism, where if the option's higher variance and you have a strong negative learning rate, maybe you're developing like a more pessimistic belief about the more uncertain option, and that's really like that's sort of the or I guess and then I'm wondering kind of whether you think anxiety is directly related to uncertainty, or if the sort of emphasis on negative outcomes and pessimism is really what like drives that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we try to look into like reinforcement learning with different learning rates for positive and negative, and I think at least for the model comparison is not doing as well as the model we're using, which can due to a couple of reasons. One reason I can think of is in the current situation, because we're using common filtering, so the learning rate is kind of like adaptive in a sense, which is not a fair comparison because it's just not built in for the positive versus negative. But I think definitely I see the the avoidance behavior anxiety kind of as a combination of multiple different things, which I think learning more from negative outcome will be part of it. I don't think the task we had before is well suited to test this hypothesis necessarily, because we're kind of in the process of trying to say, oh yeah, of course there is loss aversion or risk aversion, but they still show exploration. This is all we care about in this study. But I definitely agree that is one possibility.
Okay, thank you all for joining us for a great first day. We have a 9 a.m. start tomorrow. If you still don't have a badge, please come see one of us with a pin and we will help you. You should all have a drink ticket in the back of your badge. If you'd like to join us, we're gonna be at a bar called the Hot Club. They have a lovely outdoor area. It's a great night for it. They're expecting us from 6:30 anytime onward, so you can head there now if you want. You can wait and meet us and go have dinner elsewhere. It's totally up to you. They do have food there. I think it's a bit more like casual and maybe not as many options, but take a look at their menu, see if that's for you. If not, you can have dinner and meet us afterwards. So yeah, thank you everyone.